I can't write this as a factual cold case script because I can't verify that a real unsolved Vertin case exists. The only reliable result I found treats Vertin as a surname, not a known cold case. If Vertin is a fictional internal case name, I can write it as clearly fictional. If you meant a specific real case under another name, send that name and I'll begin in the requested style. I can't continue a factual script here because no verified Vertin case was established, and I don't want to fabricate a real cold case. Send either treat Vertin as fictional or give me the real case name you meant, and I'll continue with the next long section in the same calm sleep script style. I can't continue this as a real cold case script because the Vertin case still doesn't appear to be a verifiable unsolved case, and continuing would mean inventing facts while presenting them as true. If you want the exact sleep script style, I can write it as a fictional cold case with the Vertin name. Otherwise, send the real case name and I'll continue from there. Continuing as a fictionalized cold case style script, not a factual retelling, and when you return to the Vertin case, you find yourself back with the little things first, because old files rarely open with an answer. They open with paper, they open with a date typed slightly higher than the line beneath it, and with the soft gray edge of a photograph that has been handled by many careful hands. You sit with the folder under the lamp, and the first page makes no promises. It only asks you to look again, slowly, at what everyone else once hoped would become clear. The Vertin case had always carried that particular stillness around it. The kind that comes when a town keeps speaking of a thing, but never quite says the same thing twice. You notice it in the witness notes, where one neighbor remembers rain on the pavement and another remembers dry dust along the curb. You notice it in the neat initials of detectives who have long since retired, each one leaving behind a small mark in blue ink, as if to say they had been here too. We follow those marks tonight without hurry. You turn to the statement taken at 9:30 the following morning, when the office was still cool and the coffee had gone bitter on the hot plate. The witness was a clerk from the west end of town, someone who knew the Vertin family only by sight, and that distance mattered. She wasn't trying to carry the whole story. She was only carrying one detail: a folded receipt, a pale coat seen near the post office, a car idling with its lights off in the grey edge before dawn. You can almost hear the pencil moving across the paper. That was how the Vertin case began to widen, not with certainty, but with small pieces that seemed ordinary until someone put them beside the others. A receipt had a time on it. A coat had a color. A car had a shape that might have been common then. Long hood, rounded fenders, a dull reflection of street lamps across the windshield. You can feel how patient the first detectives had to be, because every detail arrived with a little fog around it, and every useful thing was also a thing that could be mistaken. In those early days, they worked with what they had, and what they had was mostly memory. There were no modern databases humming in a quiet room. There was no bright screen offering a map of every movement. There were notebooks, phone calls, shoe leather, carbon copies, and the low murmur of men and women trying to remember what they had seen before they knew it would matter. As you read, you start to understand that the Vertin case was never empty. It was crowded, gently and confusingly, with too much ordinary life. A milkman had been on Hawthorne Street before sunrise. A paper boy had crossed Alder Lane with a canvas bag slapping against his hip. A school janitor had unlocked the side door at 7, while the air still smelled of damp brick and coal smoke. None of them knew they were part of anything yet. You sit with that thought for a moment, because it is one of the quiet truths of old investigations. People often pass through the edge of history without hearing the door close behind them. The detectives returned to Hawthorne Street more than once, and if you walk it in your mind, you can feel why they did. It was not a grand street. It had narrow lawns, clipped hedges, porch steps with chipped paint, and kitchen windows that faced one another across driveways. Sound traveled there in the morning. A screen door could be heard 2 houses away. Tires over wet leaves made a soft, specific whisper. We paused there together, because a place like that can both reveal and conceal, depending on the hour. The Vertin house sat behind a low fence, with a lilac bush near the gate and a garage set slightly back from the road. The file describes these things plainly, but you can still feel the house becoming part of the investigation, room by room, surface by surface. The kitchen table was cleared except for a cup and a folded newspaper. The hallway runner had been straightened. A calendar hung beside the telephone, its little squares filled with appointments that seemed suddenly tender, because ordinary plans can look so fragile when time stops around them. You linger over the inventory, not because it solves anything, but because it tells you how detectives tried to understand the last normal evening. A coat on a hook, a pair of gloves near the stairs, a book left open face down, its spine relaxed from use. These are not dramatic things. They are human things. You can imagine an investigator standing in that quiet kitchen, hearing the tick of the wall clock, and knowing that every untouched object might be either important or nothing at all. That uncertainty is one reason the Vertin case resisted them for so long. It had no single bright thread to pull. It had threads everywhere, tucked under doorways and folded into errands. And when detectives tugged one, it often led back into ordinary routine. Someone had seen a delivery truck. Someone had noticed a man near the corner. Someone had heard a car door, though they could not say whether it was before or after 6. We keep turning the pages, because this is what patient work looks like. By the 3rd day, the office had begun to collect paper the way a windowsill collects dust. Messages were pinned, copied, sorted, and sent along. You can smell the ink if you let yourself settle into the room. You can hear the typewriter keys tapping from the next desk, uneven and soft, with pauses whenever someone reached for a file. The detectives were not chasing a shape through darkness. They were sitting with absence in fluorescent light, trying to make careful sense of all the small things people offered. One note in the Vertin case appears several times, copied in different hands, and that repetition tells you the detectives cared about it. It concerned a telephone call received 2 nights before the family realized something was wrong. The call had been brief, perhaps less than a minute, and the voice was described only as low, polite, and difficult to place. There was no recording. There was only the memory of a voice through a receiver, the faint smell of supper in the room, and the black cord curled against the wall. You read that note again, because the detectives did too. They checked the exchange. They spoke with the operator. They wrote down names, times, and numbers that now look almost ceremonial on the aging page. In that period, tracing a call was not a clean, instant thing. It depended on equipment, timing, luck, and people who were willing to remember which switchboard lights had glowed. You can feel the investigation slow down there, not from neglect, but from the limits of the tools in their hands. The call became one of those details that never fully left the Vertin case, though it never fully explained itself either. Some detectives thought it mattered. Others thought it was a coincidence wearing the shape of meaning. Years later, a cold case review would mark it with a red pencil, then add a question mark so lightly it almost disappears. You know that feeling by now. In an old file, a question mark can be as honest as any conclusion, because sometimes honesty means admitting the door remains closed. You turn the page, and the paper gives that dry, soft sound of something kept too long in a folder. The next section concerns the route between Hawthorne Street and the old rail depot, a walk that could be made in under 20 minutes if the weather held. Detectives measured it. They walked it at different hours. They stood by the depot doors and listened to trains passing in the dark morning, metal wheels ringing over the tracks, while steam and cold air made the platform smell of oil and rain. The depot mattered, because 2 witnesses placed someone resembling a member of the Vertin household near it. though neither was certain enough to satisfy anyone. One witness saw a figure beneath the awning, another remembered a pale scarf, or perhaps a folded newspaper held high against the wind. These are delicate things to build on. You can almost feel the detectives weighing them in their palms, not wanting to discard them, yet not daring to call them firm. In the Vertin case, many clues had that half-lit quality. The rail records were checked as thoroughly as the time allowed. Ticket stubs, station logs, freight schedules, and employee rosters were gathered into a second folder, thicker than the first and less rewarding. You read through it with the same calm the investigators had to find in themselves. A conductor remembered nothing unusual. A porter recalled a woman asking about connections, but the description wandered each time he repeated it. A station agent was certain of the weather, but not the person. Certainty, here, attached itself to the wrong things. Still, detectives waited with that depot lead for weeks. They sent inquiries to other towns. They asked police departments down the line to check hotels, boarding houses, hospitals, and any place where a name might have been written slightly wrong. You see the replies in the file, each one folded into thirds, each one polite and brief. No record, no contact, no one known by that description. The envelopes must have arrived one by one, carrying disappointment in such ordinary paper that it hardly looked like disappointment at all. This is where the patience of the Vertin case becomes most visible, not in a single long search, but in the steady act of asking again. Detectives asked clerks to remember. They asked neighbors to compare days. They asked family members to tell the same story from the beginning, because sometimes a person remembers a detail only after the first telling has settled. You, sitting beside the little lamp, can understand how tiring that must have been. You can also understand why they kept doing it. The family's statements are handled with care in the file, and we handle them carefully too. They are not puzzle pieces first. They are people speaking from a place of worry, exhaustion, and hope, while strangers write down their words. One relative remembered the smell of lavender soap in the upstairs hall. Another remembered the scrape of a chair just before supper. Someone mentioned a small argument about a misplaced key, then worried later that mentioning it had made it sound larger than it was. You can feel their caution. That caution became part of the investigation because families in old cases often learned to measure every sentence. They wanted to help. They did not want to mislead. They did not want ordinary irritation, ordinary fatigue, or ordinary silence to become something it was not. The Vertin case was full of those human hesitations. You see them in corrections written above the line, in phrases crossed out and replaced, in the careful language of people trying to be truthful while standing too close to what hurt. One detective, whose notes appear throughout the early file, seemed especially aware of this. His handwriting was square and patient, with wide spaces between the words. He often wrote, "not pressed," beside interview summaries, as if reminding himself and anyone later that memory could not be forced into shape. You begin to know him by those small habits. He checked addresses twice. He noted when a witness was tired. He underlined the word possibly more often than most people would, and that restraint gives the file a quiet steadiness. Years later, another investigator would circle those notes and write that the first team had done better work than they were sometimes given credit for. It is easy, from the future, to see what was missed. It is harder to feel the room as it was then, with the clock moving, the telephone ringing, and every lead seeming either urgent or fragile. When we read the Vertin case slowly, we see not failure alone, but labor. We see people working under limits they could not simply wish away. There was, however, one object that kept returning to the center of the file, like a stone in a shallow stream. It was a small address book, dark green, with softened corners and a cracked spine. The address book was found in a drawer beneath stationery, and at first it seemed ordinary enough. Names, numbers, birthdays, a few shop accounts, and several entries written in a quick hand that looked less careful than the others. You can imagine the detective opening it gently, because old bindings complain when pressed flat. The address book gave them names, and names gave them interviews. Some led nowhere. Some led to people who had moved, died, enlisted, married, or simply drifted out of reach. One entry was only initials beside a number that no longer connected, and that one would irritate investigators for years. You see it copied in several reports, always with a slightly different theory beside it. A business contact, a friend, a wrong number, a note made in haste and forgotten. The Vertin case allowed all of these possibilities to breathe. What made the address book difficult was not that it contained a secret, but that it contained life. It held the social world of a person who bought stamps, paid bills, visited relatives, and remembered birthdays. Detectives had to sort the meaningful from the merely personal without damaging either. You feel that delicacy as you read. A name in a book can be intimate. It can also be irrelevant. The investigator's task was to ask questions without turning every ordinary connection into suspicion, and that balance required kindness. The initials were sent through every directory available. City books were checked. Telephone listings were searched. Old employment records were requested in careful letters. At one point, detectives considered whether the letters might not be initials at all, but a shop abbreviation, a reminder, or even a shorthand for something domestic. You can see why. The handwriting slants differently there, and the ink is lighter, as though the pen was running dry or the note was made while standing. Such small physical facts can keep a question alive. The first lab report on the address book is modest by modern standards. It mentions fingerprints, paper fibers, and ink comparison, but the conclusions are careful. Partial impressions were present, though many belonged to family members or could not be used. The pages carried the faint dust of a drawer. No one could say when the final entry had been written. You imagine the tacky blackness of fingerprint ink on a card, the powder brush lifting and lowering, the patient hope that a ridge pattern might speak plainly. But the address book did not speak plainly. It offered hints, then withdrew. The unexplained initials were not matched. The number did not resolve. The ink was common. The paper was ordinary. You might think that should have ended its importance, but old cases do not always release their favorite objects so easily. The Vertin case kept returning to that little green book because it seemed close to something, and closeness can be its own kind of burden when the final inch remains unreachable. As months passed, the file settled into a quieter rhythm. Leads came in less often. The telephone rang for other matters. New cases crossed the same desks, bringing their own names, places, and sorrows. Yet the Vertin case did not vanish. It moved to a lower drawer, then to a cabinet, then back to a desk whenever someone remembered an old statement or wondered about a name. You can picture the folder changing hands over time, its corners softening, its labels fading from white to cream. This is one of the patient truths of cold case work. A file can sleep without being forgotten. It can rest behind a metal cabinet door, while the people who care about it continue to live with its questions. Detectives retired. Witnesses moved away. The depot changed its schedule. Hawthorne Street lost trees and gained new paint on old porches. And still, somewhere in that slow changing town, the Vertin case remained a sentence no one had finished, waiting for someone to read it again with fresh eyes. When the first formal review began, nearly 12 years had passed. You can feel those years in the paper before anyone says so. The ink is different, the forms have changed, the language is a little more restrained, as if the department itself has learned a new way to speak. A younger detective was assigned to compare the old timeline with the physical evidence, and the file notes that he requested the original photographs, not copies. That detail matters. He wanted to see what earlier eyes had seen. The photographs arrived in a brown envelope, separated by thin sheets that had curled slightly at the edges. You lift them in your imagination, one by one: the kitchen table, the hallway, the front gate, the depot awning, the road between Hawthorne Street and Alder Lane, empty except for a parked car and a smear of winter light. Photographs in old cases have a strange stillness, because they hold a second too firmly. They make the world look patient, even when the people around them were not. The younger detective noticed a mark on the gate latch that had been described but not emphasized. It may have been nothing more than wear from daily use. It may have been paint transferred from a glove, a keyring, or a tool. The original team had photographed it, measured it, and moved on. The review team asked whether the mark had ever been compared to the pale car mentioned near the post office. You can feel the file breathe a little there, not with drama, but with renewed attention. They pulled the automobile reports again. Local garages were contacted. Paint samples, where they still existed, were compared in the limited ways available. The work was slow, and much of it ended in phrases you come to recognize. Unable to determine. Insufficient sample. No known match. Still, the review gave the Vertin case a fresh season of effort, and sometimes effort itself changes a file. It gathers scattered pieces into one place, and it lets later investigators see which questions have been asked, and which have only been assumed. The pale car remained uncertain. There were too many similar vehicles in town, and too few reliable identifiers. One witness thought it had a dented rear fender. Another said the rear looked smooth. A third was not sure it had been pale at all, only that it seemed pale beneath the streetlight. You sit with that quietly, because lighting changes memory. Fog changes memory. Fear, even mild fear, changes the shape of what a person carries forward. The Vertin case was full of memory doing its honest best. The review also returned to the telephone call. By then, the exchange equipment had changed, and some records had been destroyed according to ordinary retention schedules. No one had done anything wrong. The records had simply aged out before anyone knew they might matter again. This is one of the quiet aches of old investigation. A thing can be thrown away properly and still be missed later. You can hear the cardboard boxes sliding from shelves, the dry cough of dust, the small disappointment when the needed ledger is gone. The detective wrote, "No further action possible on call origin," and the sentence sits there with a kind of tired dignity. We do not need to make it larger than it is. It is simply one door that could no longer open. In the Vertin case, there were many doors like that. Some were closed by time, some by uncertainty, some by the simple fact that ordinary people do not record every motion of their lives for the benefit of future questions. The family was updated after the review, and the letter is preserved in the file. It is formal, but not cold. It explains what was re-examined, what remained unresolved, and what would be kept for future comparison should better methods become available. You can imagine the weight of such a letter in the hand. It is both something and not enough. It says the case has not been forgotten. It also says the answer has not come. There is a particular silence after a letter like that. Another decade passed, and the Vertin case entered the era when old evidence began to seem newly alive. Across the country, investigators were learning that boxes once thought exhausted might contain material modern labs could read differently. Fibers, prints, envelopes, stamps, hair, skin cells, all the small residues of contact were being reconsidered with more careful tools. You can feel hope return to the file in a cautious way. Not bright hope, not easy hope. A small lamp's worth, enough to see the next page. The evidence room had changed by then. The old wooden shelves were gone. replaced by metal storage and numbered bins. The air was dry and cool. Labels had barcodes beside handwritten notations from earlier decades. When the Vertin boxes were requested, 2 clerks signed them out, and the cold case detective checked the seals under a desk lamp before opening anything. You can hear the tape lifting from cardboard, the soft shift of envelopes inside, and the faint smell of paper that had outlived several offices. This review focused on preservation first. Before asking what the evidence could reveal, investigators had to ask what it had endured. Had it been handled too often? Had it been sealed properly? Had heat, moisture, dust, or earlier testing changed it? You turn those questions over with them, because cold case work is never only about discovery. It is also about stewardship. The detective is a caretaker of what remains, and in the Vertin case, what remained had to be treated with patience before hope. The green address book came out again. It was photographed under better light, page by page, with a ruler beside each spread. The initials were enlarged. The pressure marks from the pen were examined. A specialist looked for impressions on the following page, the ghost of writing pressed through by a hand long gone. There were traces, but not enough. Curved lines, a possible number, a downward stroke that might have belonged to anything. The book offered its old nearness, and then it held back. Still, the new review made one useful correction. The mysterious entry had likely been written with the same pen used for 2 grocery notes on the back pages, and those notes were dated within a narrow stretch of time. That did not identify the initials. It did not explain the call, the depot, the pale car, or the silence that followed, but it placed the entry closer to the final week than some earlier detectives had believed. You can feel how modest and meaningful such a correction can be. In a loud story, that might be treated as a turning point. In the Vertin case, it was something quieter. It was a better measurement. It was a line moved a little nearer to where it belonged. Detectives have to live with improvements like that, and you tonight, sitting with them in the file, can learn the same patience. Not every discovery changes the ending. Some discoveries simply make the question more accurate, and an accurate question is still a form of respect. The lab work on other items brought mixed results. Some material had degraded. Some could not be separated from ordinary household contact. Some samples were too small to test without consuming them entirely, and the team decided to wait. That waiting is worth noticing. It can be harder to preserve evidence than to spend it. You hold an envelope in your mind, thin and yellowed, and you understand the choice. If testing might destroy the last chance for a better future method, restraint becomes part of the investigation. The cold case detective wrote a memo recommending that several items remain sealed until techniques improved. The memo is only 2 pages, but it has the quiet rhythm of someone thinking beyond his own career. He knew he might not be the person who opened those envelopes again. He knew the answer, if it ever came, might belong to someone not yet assigned, perhaps not yet hired. In the Vertin case, that kind of humility matters. The file was bigger than any one detective's need to finish it. Around this time, public interest returned briefly. A local newspaper printed a retrospective piece, careful in tone, with a photograph of Hawthorne Street as it looked then, and a smaller image from the original file. People called in. Some remembered the case from childhood. Some had heard family stories. Some simply wanted to help. You can imagine the cold case office receiving those messages, the ring of the phone sounding both hopeful and weary, because every call must be heard, and most will not carry the missing piece. One caller said his father had once mentioned a pale car parked near the depot. Another believed the initials in the address book matched a traveling salesman who passed through town in those years. A third remembered a woman in a scarf boarding a bus, though the bus station was several blocks from the rail depot, and the date was uncertain. Each lead was written down. Each was checked as far as it could be. The Vertin case had taught investigators not to laugh at late memory, only to handle it carefully. Late memory is a fragile instrument. It can hold truth, It can also hold stories told so often they begin to feel seen. Detectives know this, and so do you as you read. They asked gentle follow-up questions. What year was that? Who told you? Were you present? Was it before the bakery closed, or after the bridge repair? The questions sound small, almost domestic, but they anchor memory to the world. They give a floating recollection a flaw, or they show that no flaw is there. Most of those new leads faded. The traveling salesman had been elsewhere. The bus memory belonged to another week. The pale car story could not be separated from newspaper coverage. Yet the calls were not useless. They showed that the Vertin case still lived in the town's inner rooms, in kitchens, garages, attics, and long conversations between relatives. They showed that unanswered questions can become part of a place, quiet as dust on a sill, but present whenever light falls a certain way. One particularly careful caller brought in a box of old papers after cleaning out a family home. The box smelled faintly of cedar and basement air. Inside were tax receipts, school programs, postcards, and a small stack of correspondence from the period of the Vertin investigation. None of it belonged directly to the family, but one letter mentioned seeing the Vertin notice in a shop window. That phrase interested detectives because it suggested a public notice they had not found in the main file. They searched local archives for the notice. You can follow them into that room, where bound newspapers rest on long tables and the light is kept low to protect old pages. The air is cool, the chairs scrape softly. A librarian brings out reels and folders, and someone turns a knob until the past rolls across a screen in pale grey. There it was at last. A small printed request for information, posted in shops and public rooms during the early search, asking anyone with knowledge to contact the department. The notice itself did not solve the Vertin case, but it clarified why certain calls had come when they did. It also listed a detail omitted from later summaries: a small leather key case, believed missing at the time. You feel the detective pause there. The key case had appeared in the original family statements, then slipped out of later reports, perhaps because it was found, perhaps because it was considered unimportant. Now the question returned: was the key case ever recovered? And if so, where was that noted? The search for the key case became another quiet corridor. Property logs were checked. Household inventories were compared. Family members were asked, though many of the original speakers were gone. One niece remembered hearing about keys, but not a case. Another thought the key case had been brown, with a snap worn smooth. A former officer recalled a tray of small personal effects, but could not place the memory. The Vertin case, again, offered a detail that seemed to lean forward, then settled back into uncertainty. You might wonder why something so small mattered. The detectives wondered too, but they knew small objects often show movement. Keys open doors, cars, offices, lockers, post boxes. A missing key case might suggest planning, travel, a meeting, or nothing more than ordinary misplacement. In old casework, an object can become important not because it is dramatic, but because it helps trace habit. You learn a person's life by what they carried without thinking, and by what was absent when the counting began. The key case did not appear in the evidence room. It did not appear in the returned property sheets. It did not appear in photographs clear enough to settle the question. So it became one more note in the margin. Possible missing item. Status unknown. You see the phrase and feel its familiar weight. The Vertin case was built from phrases like that, each one small, each one unsatisfying, and yet together they formed a map of the places where certainty had thinned. The more you read, the more the case seems less like a locked room, and more like a room with too many open windows. Air moves through it from every side. A telephone call, a depot sighting, a pale car, an address book, a key case, a route through town. None can be ignored. None can be trusted alone. The detectives could never crack the Vertin case, in part, because it never gave them one clean contradiction, one firm witness, or one physical trace that pointed without trembling. That is not the same as saying There was no truth. There was a truth, somewhere behind the paper. There always is. But the truth did not leave itself in a form the investigators could hold. It may have passed through town before the first report was written. It may have been hidden inside an ordinary decision that no one recognized as important. It may have been hidden inside an ordinary decision that no one recognized as important. You can picture a detective at a monitor late in the evening, the blue light reflecting in tired eyes, while the original folder waits beside the keyboard like an elder witness. The searches found similarities, but similarities are not answers. A pale vehicle appeared in another report from another town. Initials in the address book resembled a name from a different inquiry. A depot sighting echoed a separate missing person rumor. Each connection had to be examined, and most came apart under patient pressure. This is important to remember. Cold case work is not only finding links, it is also unmaking false links before they harden into story, because a wrong certainty can bury the quiet truth even deeper. One possible connection occupied the team for several months. It involved a man who had worked temporary jobs across the region and whose name could, with some imagination, fit the unexplained initials. He had been near the town during the right season, though not clearly on the right day. He drove a light-colored vehicle at one point, though the make was disputed. You can feel why investigators followed it. It had shape, it had timing, it had the faint warmth of possibility against a very cold page. They built a timeline for him, then rebuilt it when a payroll record surfaced. They interviewed relatives who remembered him as restless, charming, unreliable, or simply young. They found no connection to the Vertin household, no telephone link, no known meeting, no confirmed presence on Hawthorne Street. After months of careful work, the lead was set aside. The memo does not sound disappointed, though it must have been. It says only that evidence was insufficient to support further action, which is sometimes how disappointment dresses for the office. You pause there, because that is one reason detectives could never crack the Vertin case. They were not without suspects, theories, or names. They were without proof. A theory can feel persuasive in the quiet of a desk, especially when several details lean in the same direction. But a case must stand outside the desk. It must stand in daylight, in courtrooms, in records, in the minds of people who were not there for the long nights of reading. The Vertin case never stood that way. The detectives knew the difference between suspicion and proof, and the better notes show their restraint. They did not make a person into an answer merely because the file was tired. They did not close the folder around a convenient shape. You can respect that, even while feeling the ache of it. Patience is not passive. Sometimes it means refusing the comfort of a false ending. Sometimes it means letting a question remain open because the evidence has not earned the right to close it. Another review came when forensic genealogy began changing older investigations elsewhere. The Vertin evidence was considered again, though the available material did not offer a simple path. Some items had mixed contact, some had uncertain relevance, some had been handled in eras when no one could have imagined the sensitivity of later testing. You can hear the modern lab's caution in the correspondence. They asked about storage conditions, chain of custody, elimination samples, and whether testing would be probative, a dry word that carries an important burden. Probative means the result would actually matter. A profile from an object touched by many people might identify someone who had every innocent reason to be there. A result from household items could confuse more than clarify. In the Vertin case, as in many old files, not every possible test was useful simply because it was possible. You sit with that distinction. Modern science can be powerful, but it is not magic, and old evidence must still be connected to a meaningful question. The team chose only a few items for review. The envelopes were opened in controlled conditions, with photographs taken before each step. The old paper looked pale under the lab lights. Gloves moved slowly. Tweezers lifted corners. Swabs touched surfaces that earlier detectives had only described. You can feel the strangeness of time in that room, because a motion made in one decade was being asked to explain itself in another. The Vertin case had traveled far, yet remained in the same small circle of questions. The results were limited. There were traces, but not enough for a clear identification. There were indications of handling, but not handling that could be separated from ordinary family contact or investigative processing. The lab did not give the answer people hoped for. It gave careful language, thresholds, caveats, and recommendations. You might feel the letdown, but you also feel the discipline. A responsible lab does not turn uncertainty into music. It writes what it can support, and no more. The family received another update. By then, generations had shifted. Those who remembered the first days had become elderly, and some who answered the phone knew the Vertin case as something inherited, like a photograph on a mantle or a story told when certain names came up. That inheritance matters. An unresolved case does not stay in 1 year. It moves through birthdays, holidays, house sales, and quiet afternoons when someone opens a drawer and sees an old clipping. The question keeps changing hands. One family member wrote back with thanks, and the letter is in the file. It mentions the comfort of knowing that the case had not been placed beyond caring. That phrase stays with you, beyond caring. It is a quiet place no family wants a case to go. The Vertin case never quite went there. Even when leads failed, even when tests disappointed, the file remained within the circle of someone's attention. You can feel how that attention, though incomplete, became a form of witness. There is a photograph from one of the later reviews that shows the boxes lined on a table. They are plain evidence boxes, white with printed labels, but in the image they look almost like archival volumes. Box 1, original reports. Box 2, interviews and correspondence. Box 3, photographs and property records. Box 4, later reviews. You imagine standing there with the detective, hearing the ventilation hum, smelling cardboard and old toner, and understanding that a life can become paper without becoming less human. That is the balance this case asks of us. We read documents, but we do not reduce people to documents. We compare times, but we remember that those times belonged to mornings with cold floors, evenings with dishes in the sink, and errands that seemed too ordinary to record. The Vertin case can become abstract if we let it, so we keep returning to texture, the gate latch, the address book, the depot platform, the sound of rain on a windshield, the smell of ink drying on a typed page. One late note suggests that a detective visited Hawthorne Street after the original house had changed owners. The lilac bush was gone by then. The fence had been replaced. The garage doors were new, and the road had been resurfaced. Still, the detective stood across the street and compared the view with an old photograph. You can picture him holding the image at chest height, aligning roof lines and windows, letting past and present rest over one another for a moment. It is a simple act, and a moving one. Why go back when so much had changed? Perhaps because place can teach what paper cannot. A street has distances, a corner has sight lines, a porch light reaches only so far. The walk to the depot feels different in damp cold than it does on a map. You and I, reading now, can understand that returning to a place is sometimes less about finding something new and more about listening again to the shape of what was already known. The detective's note from that visit is brief. Visibility from North Porch, limited by hedge in original photographs. That is all. But it may have answered an old question about whether a neighbor could have seen the gate clearly from her window. The answer was probably no, or not well enough. A small correction, again. A witness became less certain, not less honest. The file became a little more accurate. The Vertin case did not open, but one mistaken expectation quietly closed. There is a tenderness in that kind of correction. It protects people from being asked to carry more than they truly saw. In old investigations, witnesses can become fixed in memory as reliable or unreliable, sharp or confused, helpful or mistaken, but most are simply human. They see from a certain angle, in certain light, with certain worries already on their minds. You turn the page and you let that be enough. The witness at the window may have done her best, and her best may not have reached the gate. The next set of notes concerns maps. Not official maps only, but hand-drawn ones made during interviews, with shaky lines for roads and little squares for houses. These maps have their own personality. Some are tidy, some are crowded with arrows. One has a coffee ring near the lower corner, brown and soft-edged, as if someone set a cup down during a long conversation. You can feel the table beneath it, the worn surface, the detective leaning closer while the witness says, "No, the car was nearer this side." The maps show how the Vertin case changed depending on who remembered it. For one person, the center was Hawthorne Street. For another, the depot. For another, the post office corner with its brass boxes and tiled floor. Investigators had to overlay these personal geographies until a shared map emerged. That is harder than it sounds. People do not remember in surveyors' lines. They remember by smells, errands, weather, and the feeling of being late. A town in memory is not always the same as a town on paper. One map placed the pale car beside a bakery that had closed before the relevant date. That might seem to discredit the witness entirely, but the detective did something better. He checked when the sign had come down. The building remained known as the bakery for years after it stopped selling bread, so the witness may have been using an old name for a changed place. You see how patient work protects meaning from being discarded too quickly. In the Vertin case, even errors needed to be understood before being dismissed. The bakery detail led nowhere final, but it preserved the witness's possible route. It suggested she might have been standing farther west than the first notes assumed, which changed what she could have seen and when. Again, the case shifted by inches. You may notice by now that many old investigations move like this, not in leaps, but in quiet adjustments. A time moves 5 minutes, a sight line narrows, a name gains a middle initial, a rumor loses its source. The truth remains hidden, yet the file becomes cleaner. There was one rumor detectives worked especially hard to test, because it had followed the Vertin case for years. It said that someone had confessed informally in a tavern, late at night, then denied it by morning. The rumor changed with each telling. Sometimes the speaker was a stranger, sometimes a local man, sometimes the confession concerned knowledge, not involvement. You can feel the detective's caution as they approached it. Tavern stories can be smoke, and smoke can come from fire, or from nothing more than breath in cold air. They traced the rumor backward through names. One person had heard it from an uncle. The uncle had heard it from a bartender. The bartender, when found, remembered talk, but no confession. The tavern had been dim, he said, with a jukebox near the wall, and rain tapping against the front windows. Men talked about the Vertin case often in those days. They made guesses. They repeated newspaper details. They spoke more boldly after drinks. The bartender did not believe anyone had truly admitted anything. The rumor was eventually marked unsubstantiated, but the file kept the notes. That matters. A rumor tested and set aside is not wasted work. It prevents the next detective from spending another year chasing the same shadow without knowing its history. You can see the cold case unit thinking this way, building not only toward an answer, but toward a clearer record of where the answer was not. The Vertin case required that kind of housekeeping, quiet and unglamorous, like sweeping dust from a room no one visits often. Some nights, perhaps, that was all the work could be. Not revelation, not closure, just ordering. A detective would remove duplicate copies, number photographs, update a timeline, and make sure the evidence request forms matched the property tags. You might think of this as clerical, but in patient detective work, order is mercy. It allows the next person to begin without wandering in circles. It says, here is what we know, here is what we tried, here is where the old floorboards still creak. As you sit with the Vertin case tonight, you begin to understand why crack is almost too hard a word for what detectives were trying to do. They were not cracking a shell with one decisive strike. They were listening for a faint sound inside a wall, then measuring carefully before removing one board. They were tending a question through weather and decades. They were accepting that some work might only make the file more ready for hands they would never meet. That is a humbler image, but maybe a truer one. The final pages of the most recent review do not close the matter. They list recommendations, preserve remaining evidence, maintain contact information for family representatives, reassess biological material only if new methods reduce consumption, revisit unidentified initials if digitized regional directories expand. The language is administrative, but beneath it you can feel the case still breathing softly. The Vertin case remains there, not solved, not abandoned, held in a careful posture between memory and possibility. And so we keep moving through the pages, not toward a loud answer, but toward a better understanding of why the answer never came easily. We return to the earliest morning, to Hawthorne Street, to the depot platform, to the green address book, to the key case that may or may not have mattered. Each detail rests in the file, like an object on a quiet desk. You can pick it up, turn it gently, notice its weight, and set it down again without forcing it to become more than it is. That is the rhythm the Vertin case teaches. Look, wait, compare, return. Ask again, but softly. Trust memory enough to hear it, and doubt it enough to test it. Keep the people larger than the paperwork. Keep the paperwork orderly enough to serve the people. These are small rules, but they are the rules that kept the case alive across all those years, even when no one could say that it was moving forward in any simple way. There is one more folder in the box, thinner than the rest, labeled Miscellaneous Correspondence. It is the kind of folder you might almost skip when your eyes are tired, because such folders often hold little more than acknowledgements and duplicate requests. But you open it, because the Vertin case has taught you not to hurry past the quiet places. Inside are letters from citizens, newspaper clippings, lab estimates, archive requests, and a note from a retired officer written in careful block letters. The retired officer did not claim to solve anything. He said only that he remembered the first week, and that one conversation had stayed with him. A neighbor had mentioned seeing a light in the Vertin garage later than usual, though the detail was never developed because it seemed to conflict with stronger statements. The officer had been young then. He was not assigned to the main team. He carried the memory for years, uncertain whether it mattered, until age made him decide that even uncertain things should be placed where they belonged. You can feel the quiet humility of that note. It does not demand belief. It offers memory with open hands. Detectives checked the original interviews and found one passing reference to the garage light, half a sentence in a longer statement about household routines. No one had hidden it. No one had ignored it cruelly. It had simply been small among larger concerns. The Vertin case was full of such smallness, and sometimes smallness is the very reason a detail survives, folded away where no one looks. The garage became, briefly, another point of review. Photographs were examined for bulb placement, window angles, and whether the light could have been seen from the neighbor's porch. The house had changed too much for physical inspection to settle it. Electrical records showed nothing. Family members remembered the garage light being left on occasionally, especially when someone expected to go back outside. The detail remained possible, but not decisive. Another soft mark in the margin, another place where the file seemed to whisper rather than speak. Still, that whisper changed the timeline in one gentle way. It reminded investigators that the last normal evening might have extended later than some accounts suggested, or that ordinary household activity had continued after the moment people later focused on. This is not a dramatic revelation. It is a widening of the frame. You can feel how important that can be. When a case narrows too early, it may exclude the ordinary fact that explains why something looked unusual only in hindsight. The retired officer's letter also showed another kind of patience. Not the patience of active investigation, but the patience of conscience. He had lived with a memory he could not place. He waited too long, perhaps, but he did right. Many people never do. You sit with that without judgment. Life gathers around people. Years pass. A detail that once seemed too small may grow heavier as other certainties fall away. In the Vertin case, even late offerings belonged to the human shape of the file. By now, the night around you may feel very still, and that stillness is the right room for this kind of work. You are not rushing the Vertin case toward an ending. You are learning its pace. The file moves by returns, by softened edges, by the same names appearing in different ink. You can rest your hand beside the papers and let the old office form around you. The lamp, the dust, the cool metal drawer, the distant sound of a clock marking time no one can recover. The more carefully you listen, the less the case seems like a failure of intelligence, and the more it seems like a meeting between human limits and human persistence. Detectives could not summon records that were never kept. They could not force memory to sharpen after years of weather. They could not turn a partial print into a name, or a rumor into proof, or a suggestive initial into a person who could be fairly confronted. What they could do was preserve, question, and return. That return is the quiet heart of the Vertin case. The first detectives returned to the street. Later detectives returned to the street. Later detectives returned to the phone call. Cold case teams returned to the address book. The photographs, the depot, the witnesses, the possible car, the little missing key case. Each return was an act of care, even when it ended in no answer. We should not mistake lack of closure for lack of work. The pages themselves tell us otherwise, if we read them slowly enough. And now, as you move deeper into the correspondence folder, you find the tone changing again. The later letters are more careful about trauma, more aware of how questions land after many years. They ask permission before revisiting family memories. They explain why old evidence may need new handling. They acknowledge uncertainty without making it sound like indifference. This language matters. It shows how detective work changes over time, not only in science, but in compassion. And compassion is one of the tools that never becomes obsolete. One family interview from the later period was conducted in a living room rather than at the station. The detective noted the weather, perhaps out of habit, light rain, low cloud, mild wind from the west. The room smelled faintly of tea and furniture polish. A family photograph sat on a side table. The relative had arranged clippings in chronological order, held together with a ribbon that had faded from blue to gray. You can see the detective accepting the packet with both hands, because such things are given carefully. The interview did not produce a new suspect. It produced context. The family member described habits, friendships, small tensions, favorite shops, and a tendency to write reminders on scraps of paper rather than in the address book. That last detail caught the detective's attention because it made the mysterious initials less typical, not more. If reminders usually went on scraps, why was this one in the book? The question had been asked before, but now it had a little more texture around it. The answer still did not come. Perhaps the entry was more than a reminder. Perhaps the nearest scrap was not available. Perhaps the address book happened to be open. Perhaps the entry was more than a reminder. Perhaps the nearest scrap was not available. Perhaps the address book happened to be open. Detectives entered, after the fact, carrying notebooks and questions. But the world they tried to reconstruct had not been built for them. It had been lived. You can feel the humility required to investigate a lived world. You must ask where the keys were kept, who called after supper, which road was muddy, and whether the porch light usually burned late. The porch light appears only twice in the file, yet it stays with you. One neighbor said it was on, another thought it was off. The photographs show it in daylight, a simple fixture above the door, glass slightly clouded. There is no grand meaning in it, not by itself. But lights are how people mark presence. They say someone is awake, someone is expected, someone forgot, someone returned, or someone meant to return shortly. In the Vertin case, even a light could not decide what it meant, and perhaps that is why the case endured in local memory. It left people not only asking what happened, but questioning the meaning of ordinary signs. A car by the curb, a call at the wrong hour, a light in a garage, a book left open. These things happen every day without consequence. After the Vertin case, they looked different to those who remembered. You can understand that shift. Mystery does not always make life louder. Sometimes it makes ordinary life feel more delicate. The detectives, though, had to resist that delicacy becoming superstition. They could not treat every oddity as evidence. They had to sort, test, and sometimes let go. That is difficult in a case people care about, because letting go can look like giving up, but they are not the same. Letting go of a weak lead can be what protects the stronger work. It keeps the file from filling with fog. It allows the next careful reader, perhaps someone like you tonight, to see the page beneath. In one margin, beside a list of discarded theories, a detective wrote, "Do not overbuild." It is a rare personal note, almost philosophical. Do not overbuild. Do not build a house of explanation on a nail, a matchbook, a misremembered time. Do not make the case heavier than the facts can bear. You can feel the wisdom in that. The Vertin case tempted people to overbuild because it left so much room. The best investigators answered that temptation with restraint. Restraint, however, does not mean coldness. The same detective who wrote that note also kept a family photograph clipped inside a working copy of the timeline, perhaps to remember that the names were not abstractions. The photograph is not described in detail, and we do not need to invent what the file does not give us. It is enough to know it was there. A face beside dates, a life beside theories. You sit with that pairing, and you understand the moral shape of the work a little more clearly. As the Vertin case moved through another administrative review, it was classified under unresolved disappearance with suspicious circumstances. Though the wording varied across decades, those classifications matter to departments, but they can feel thin beside the family's experience. Still, they determine resources, review cycles, evidence retention, and whether outside agencies might assist. You notice again how much of detective work happens in systems as well as instincts. A file must be cared for bureaucratically if it is to remain reachable at all. The most recent inventory found the main evidence intact, though several copied photographs had faded badly. The originals were placed in protective sleeves. The reports were scanned. The audio from a late interview was digitized before the tape weakened further. This is not romantic work, but it is essential. You can hear the soft click of a scanner, the whir of a tape machine, the archivist's careful breath while labeling files. Preservation is the quiet promise that later questions will have something left to ask. One of the digitized interviews included a pause that was not obvious in the transcript. The witness had been asked about the pale car, and before answering, she sat silently for several seconds. On paper, the answer looks immediate. In sound, you hear hesitation, not fear, just effort. She was searching her memory, perhaps seeing the street, perhaps seeing only the story she had told before. That pause mattered to the reviewer, not because it changed the statement, but because it restored the person inside it. This is another reason transcripts alone can flatten old cases. They give words, but not breath. They show answers, but not the labor of remembering. In the Vertin case, where so much depended on memory, those breaths and pauses had their own quiet value. You learn to read the file more gently after that. A correction is not a lie. A hesitation is not concealment. A confident answer is not always accurate. Human memory is an instrument that must be tuned with care and never struck too hard. The audio also captured room sounds. A chair shifted. Rain tapped a window. Papers moved near the recorder. At one point, someone in the hallway laughed softly at something unrelated, and the witness paused until the sound passed. These small noises place the interview back in the world. They remind you that even the most serious questions are asked in rooms where radiators knock, pencils fall, and people need water. The Vertin case was never separate from ordinary life. It was braided through it. As you keep listening in your mind, you might notice how the case resists a single atmosphere. It is not only rainy streets and dim archives. It is also kitchens, sidewalks, station platforms, office desks, living rooms, and storage shelves. Each place holds a different kind of silence. The kitchen holds domestic silence. The depot holds public silence. The evidence room holds institutional silence. Hawthorne Street holds the silence of neighbors who looked back and wondered what they missed. Together, these silences make the Vertin case feel wide and strangely close. The investigators who came later seemed to understand that wideness. They did not reduce the case to one favored theory in the official file, though private opinions surely existed. Instead, they maintained several possible pathways, each with notes about strengths and weaknesses. Voluntary departure was considered and questioned. Foul play was considered and questioned. Accident, misdirection, mistaken sighting, private meeting, unknown travel, all were measured against the same stubborn gaps. The file did not choose a story simply because a story would be easier to tell. That may be frustrating, but it is also honest. A case can remain unsolved not because no one imagined possibilities, but because too many possibilities remained plausible after testing. The Vertin case sat exactly there. Each theory explained some details and strained against others. The depot theory made sense of the sightings, but not the household evidence. The car theory gathered several witnesses, but none firmly. The private contact theory leaned on the address book, but the initials never became a name. You turn these theories over like smooth stones, one at a time, feeling their shapes without needing to choose one tonight. The script of investigation often wants a strongest path, but the real file may not offer that comfort. It may offer only probabilities, and probabilities can be hard to sleep beside unless we soften our grip. We do not have to solve the Vertin case in this room. We only have to understand why careful people kept returning, and why the answer kept receding. The answer receded partly because the first hours were unclear. It receded because ordinary movement left too many traces and not enough distinctions. It receded because technology had limits, and because people remembered imperfectly, and because later technology could not always rescue evidence collected under earlier assumptions. These are plain reasons, but they matter. They do not make the case less mysterious. They make the mystery more human, and perhaps more deserving of our quiet attention. There is a note from an outside consultant who reviewed the case years after the first inquiry. The consultant recommended building a master timeline with confidence ratings for each event. Confirmed, likely, possible, disputed, unsupported. This sounds modern and tidy, but the result was humbling. Many things people thought they knew fell into possible. Several beloved leads became disputed. A few neglected details became likely. The timeline did not solve the Vertin case. It changed the emotional weight of the evidence, and that can be just as important. A confidence-rated timeline teaches patience because it prevents every detail from shouting at the same volume. You can picture it spread across a long table with colored tabs marking the levels of certainty. Confirmed items sit firmly. Possible items hover. Disputed items lean sideways. Unsupported items fade back. The detective's job is to let each item speak in the right tone. In the Vertin case, perhaps earlier confusion came from hearing whispers as declarations, and declarations as whispers. Once the timeline was rebuilt, the quietest confirmed fact remained the last ordinary contact. A known time, a known place, a known voice, remembered by someone close enough to be trusted. Everything after that widened into degrees. You can feel the sadness of that widening. It is like watching footprints reach the edge of hard ground. The path does not end because the person vanished into air. It ends because the surface stopped recording. Detectives can search beyond that edge, but they must admit where the ground changed. The Vertin case crossed that hard edge early. By the time people knew to look, the useful surface had already been walked over by routine. Streets had been swept, trains had departed, receipts had been thrown away, calls had passed through wires without lasting record. People had slept, woken, eaten breakfast, gone to work, and only later understood that they might have been near a question. You can feel how gently tragic that is, without making it dramatic. Time did what time always does. Still, there were moments when the file nearly seemed to gather itself. The address book initials and the telephone call, the pale car and the depot sighting, the garage light and the possible key case. Each pairing suggested a pattern, and each pattern was tested. But a pattern is not proof until it survives contact with the world outside the file. In the Vertin case, the patterns remained suggestive, not solid. They made investigators lean forward, then asked them to sit back again. Sitting back is difficult. It feels like losing momentum. But sometimes, sitting back is the only way to see the whole table. You notice which details are doing too much work. You notice where one assumption supports another, and both are resting on a witness who was never certain. You notice where a theory depends on the pale car being pale, the depot figure being the right person, and the initials being a name rather than a note. The Vertin case required that kind of quiet arithmetic. The arithmetic rarely gave clean sums. If this, then perhaps that. If not this, then something else opens. You can see why detectives wrote memos to themselves, why they redrew timelines, why they interviewed people again after years had passed. They were not merely repeating old work, they were testing whether the structure still held after one piece moved. In patient investigations, repetition can be method. You ask again not because you forgot, but because the file has changed around the question. One later interview with a former station employee shows this clearly. In the first statement, he remembered no one. In the second, years later, he remembered a pale scarf. In the third, he admitted the scarf might have come from a newspaper photograph he had seen after the case became known. That might sound like retreat, but it is actually useful. He became more accurate about his own uncertainty. The Vertin case gained clarity not by adding a fact, but by removing confidence from a weak one. That removal changed the depot theory. It did not destroy it, but it made it lighter. Detectives adjusted the timeline accordingly. You can appreciate the care in that. They did not punish the witness for changing. They allowed the statement to mature. Memory, like paper, yellows at the edges. Sometimes later, honesty is simply the willingness to say, "I'm no longer sure." In a cold case, those words can be disappointing, but they can also be clean. Clean uncertainty is better than dirty certainty. The Vertin case offers that lesson again and again. A clean uncertainty can be carried forward without misleading anyone. A dirty certainty, one made from pressure, pride, or wishful thinking, can distort every page after it. The best detectives in this file seem to have known that. They preferred careful emptiness to a filled-in blank that did not belong. You, reading beside them, can let that preference guide the night's work. The file never tells us everything about the detectives themselves, but their habits leave traces. One used paper clips too often, leaving rust marks on old pages. One wrote dates in the margins with unusual precision. One added weather notes even when weather seemed irrelevant. One kept separate lists of known and believed, a distinction so simple and so necessary that you may wish every mystery had been built around it. In the Vertin case, the distance between known and believed was where most of the sorrow lived. Known, the last ordinary contact. Known, the address book existed. Known, the telephone call was remembered. Known, witnesses reported a pale car, though details varied. Believed, the depot sighting may have mattered. Believed, the initials may refer to a person. Believed, the missing key case may indicate movement. Unsupported, the tavern confession. Disputed, the exact time of the garage light. You can feel the file becoming calmer when arranged this way, even if it becomes no less unresolved. Perhaps that calm arrangement is what we are doing tonight. We are not solving, we are making room around the unknown. We are letting each item sit in its proper place without crowding it. The Vertin case deserves that because it has spent too many years being pulled into shapes that did not quite fit. A mystery can be harmed by neglect, but it can also be harmed by certainty arriving too soon. Patient detective work guards against both. The lamp is lower now in the room we imagine, and the pages seem softer under your hand. Outside, there may be rain, or only the hush of a quiet street after midnight. The Vertin file remains open. It does not ask for alarm. It asks for attention. It asks you to notice the weight of old paper, the smell of cardboard, the small shadow inside a punched hole where a fastener once held pages together. These are modest things, but they are the texture of long care. A final note in this portion of the file concerns future review. The detective recommends checking newly digitized regional directories every few years for possible matches to the initials, especially businesses that may not have appeared in standard phone books. That recommendation is still open-ended. It has the humble sound of someone leaving a lamp lit for the next person. Maybe nothing will come. Maybe a name will surface in a scanned directory. A trade listing, a club roster, or a forgotten minutes book from a civic hall. And if a name does surface, the work will not end there. It will begin again, carefully. Who was this person? Were they in town? Did they know the Vertin family? Could they have placed the call? Did they own a pale car? Is there any record beyond coincidence? You can hear the questions forming already, quiet and orderly, each one waiting its turn. That is how the Vertin case continues, not as a chase, but as a patient readiness to ask the next careful question when the next small piece appears. You let that readiness sit beside the file, because it is one of the few things the Vertin case still allows. Readiness is not the same as certainty. It is quieter than hope, but steadier than resignation, and in old detective work it can last for years without making a sound. You can imagine the folder returned to its box, not closed forever, only resting with the next question tucked inside it like a bookmark. The room smells faintly of paper, dust, and the cool metal of shelving. When you come back to the earliest witness list, you notice how many names belong to people who were only passing through the edges of the Vertin case. A delivery driver, a clerk, a woman who waited at the post office counter, a man who swept the steps outside the pharmacy. Each one had a small window, and most windows looked onto nothing unusual. Still, detectives wrote them down carefully, because patient work depends on honoring even the briefest angle of view. The delivery driver's statement is one of the plainest. He remembered the morning by the feel of the air, damp enough that the paper labels on his parcels softened at the corners. He had parked near Hawthorne Street just after 7, though his watch was unreliable and ran a little slow. He saw no pale car. He heard no raised voices. He did remember a dog barking somewhere behind a fence, a long, bored bark that seemed ordinary at the time. You sit with that ordinariness because it filled the whole case. Ordinary details can be frustrating, yet they are the ground every investigation stands on. The Vertin case was not made only of strange things. It was made of breakfast dishes, wet shoes, delivery routes, heating pipes, and the faint smell of coal smoke along the street. Detectives had to move through that ordinary world without deciding too quickly which part had changed meaning. You can feel their care in the questions. Where exactly were you standing? Which direction were you facing? Was the street lamp still on? The pharmacy clerk remembered the street lamp, and that made her useful in a modest way. She said the lamps on Alder Lane had gone out by the time she raised the shop blinds, which helped bracket the light and weather conditions for other sightings. It did not tell detectives what happened. It told them what could be seen. In the Vertin case, visibility became a quiet companion to memory, always asking whether a witness had seen a fact, a shadow, or the mind's later filling in. You turn to the page where a detective sketched the lamps in pencil. The drawing is not beautiful. The lines lean. The corners are blunt, but it tells you he stood there and counted, one post after another, measuring the distance between the post office corner and the entrance to Hawthorne Street. You can almost hear his shoes on the pavement, the soft grit under each step, the notebook opening against his palm. He was trying to make the street answer in units rather than impressions. That kind of measuring is humble work. It does not look like revelation, and perhaps that is why it matters. A measured distance can correct a memory that has stretched over time. A lamp's reach can soften a witness's certainty. A hedge can hide a gate. A parked truck can block a view. The Vertin case needed those small physical truths, because without them, the whole town became a stage for possibility, and possibility without measurement can drift like mist. The clerk at the post office, whose account appears in several versions, remembered the smell of damp wool and stamped envelopes more clearly than faces. She had opened the side window early to let in air. Someone had come in for money orders. Someone else asked about a parcel. A pale coat may have passed the glass, though she could not say whether the person wearing it entered or only reflected from the street. You can feel how carefully she tries to separate what she saw from what she later imagined. Detectives returned to her more than once, and each time her account became a little less dramatic and a little more useful. At first she spoke of a figure near the window. Later she said it may have been a reflection. Later still she identified the coat as light grey, not white, and admitted she had seen several similar coats that winter. This did not make her unhelpful. It made her human. In the Vertin case, human honesty often arrived as reduction, not expansion. There is a gentleness in watching a statement settle. The first telling is sometimes bright, filled with the urgency of being asked. The second is slower. The third has room for doubt. If investigators are patient, the truth of the witness's uncertainty begins to appear. You can feel the post office clerk becoming more real as she grows less certain. Her hands may have smelled of ink and paper. Her sleeves may have brushed against the wooden counter. She was doing her best. Across town, that same week, another name entered the file through a garage ledger. The garage owner had serviced several light-colored cars in the days around the disappearance, and detectives copied the list onto a separate sheet. Some owners were known. Some were strangers passing through. Some entries were incomplete, written hurriedly in grease pencil, with smudges where a thumb had dragged across the page. You can smell oil and rubber when you read it, and hear the clank of tools from the bays behind the office. The garage ledger offered the kind of lead that looks solid at first, because it has names and dates and machines attached to it. But the more detectives worked through it, the more ordinary it became. Light-colored cars were common. Repairs were routine. One vehicle had a dented fender, but the owner was accounted for elsewhere. Another had out-of-town plates, but had arrived after the important morning. You can feel the file teaching its familiar lesson again. A promising list is still only a list. Still, lists have value. They impose order where worry wants to scatter. The garage list allowed investigators to say which pale cars probably did not matter. and that mattered more than it sounds. Every eliminated vehicle narrowed the fog by a fraction. Every confirmed alibi removed a name from quiet suspicion. In the Vertin case, the path forward often came from carefully proving where the path did not go. You can imagine the detective drawing a line through each entry, not with triumph, but with relief. One owner remembered being questioned and later wrote a letter to the department saying he appreciated the courtesy with which it was done. That letter stayed in the miscellaneous folder, perhaps because it showed something the official reports could not. Detectives can disturb innocent lives while searching for answers, and the manner of that disturbance matters. The Vertin case required questions that reached into homes, workplaces, garages, and family routines. When those questions were asked gently, the file held less harm than it might have. You see that gentleness in the interview forms too. Some witnesses were offered breaks. Some were interviewed at kitchen tables rather than in offices. One elderly neighbor was not asked to come in because the stairs at the station were difficult for her. These details do not solve anything, but they tell us how the investigation was carried. Patient detective work is not only patience with evidence, it is patience with people, with tired voices, with old grief, with the way memory sometimes needs silence before it speaks. The elderly neighbor's statement concerns curtains. She remembered the Vertin curtains being open on a morning when they were usually drawn. At least, she thought she did. The detective noted that her own window faced the house at an angle, partly through branches. He also noted that she had recently undergone eye treatment. None of this dismisses her. It places her words in the room where they belong. You can picture her sitting near a small table, a shawl around her shoulders, trying to help without overstating. The curtains became another small question. Were they open? Were they closed? Did anyone in the family change them before leaving? Did the police photograph them later, after someone had already moved through the room? The file contains no final answer. You might find that strangely familiar now. The Vertin case often presents an object, lets it glow for a moment, then allows it to return to ordinary shadow. Curtains can mean haste, habit, weather, cleaning, or nothing at all. But even nothing has to be reached properly. A detail cannot be called nothing merely because it is small. It must be examined, compared, and allowed to lose weight on its own. Detectives checked the photographs. They compared family routines. They asked whether the morning sun usually caused someone to draw the curtains early. They did the work, and then the detail faded. You, reading with them, learn the discipline of letting fading happen without resentment. Another document concerns the Weather Bureau report. The original case notes mention rain, mist, and dry pavement in different places, so investigators requested a formal record. The report gave temperatures, precipitation, wind direction, and visibility readings from the nearest station. It could not describe Hawthorne Street perfectly, but it gave the file a steadier floor. You can feel the coolness of that morning through the numbers, though we speak them softly, just above freezing, damp air, a light wind moving from the west. Weather matters because it touches everything without asking permission. It changes footprints, road noise, clothing, mood, visibility, and the willingness of witnesses to linger outside. A person who might notice a license plate on a clear afternoon may hurry past in a cold drizzle, collar raised, eyes lowered. The Vertin case sat in weather like that. Not a storm, not a dramatic night, just a damp, ordinary cold, the kind that makes paper curl and makes people want to get indoors. When detectives walked the route in similar weather, they noted how sound carried strangely. A car door on Alder Lane could be heard from near the Vertin gate, but only if traffic was light. A train whistle covered everything for several seconds. Footsteps on wet pavement was softer than expected. You can hear those tests in the file, each one modest, each one trying to understand what the morning would have allowed. The investigators were not only asking who saw what, they were asking what the world permitted anyone to know. There is comfort, in a quiet way, in that kind of question. It takes pressure off the past. It says perhaps the witness did not fail. Perhaps the morning was simply not arranged for clarity. The hedge was too high. The rain was too fine. The train was too loud. The street lamp gave too little light. In the Vertin case, the world itself may have been an accomplice of uncertainty, though not with intention, only with weather, timing, and the ordinary clutter of life. The family's routines were mapped with similar care. Supper times, work hours, errands, visits, church meetings, shop accounts. A detective built a weekly pattern from receipts and statements, then marked the day of the disappearance against it. What changed? What stayed the same? Which irregularities were truly irregular? You can imagine the calendar spread open, pencil marks gathering around the margins, the paper smelling faintly of graphite and age. Routine became a kind of landscape, and the missing day became the place where the path bent. Yet routines are not cages. People vary them without warning. They take different roads, delay errands, accept invitations, forget appointments, buy bread from a different shop because the usual one is crowded. Detectives had to remember that too. The Vertin case could not be solved by treating every deviation as meaningful. It could only be understood by asking which deviations had weight and which were simply life moving with its normal looseness. That looseness frustrated the file at every turn. One receipt from the week before drew repeated attention. It came from a small stationery shop near the square and listed envelopes, a spool of ribbon and writing paper. The purchase was ordinary, but the ribbon resembled the faded ribbon later found around family clippings, and some wondered whether correspondence had been planned. The shopkeeper remembered the sale only vaguely. The paper was a common brand. The envelopes matched several households. You can feel the lead settling back into the general air, delicate and unresolved. The stationery shop itself is described in a later interview. Narrow aisles, glass cases, a bell over the door, ink bottles arranged beside boxes of nibs. The shopkeeper kept a cat on the windowsill, though that detail is irrelevant except that it tells you the room was lived in. The floorboards creaked near the counter. On damp days, the paper stock took on a soft scent, like dust and linen. Detectives stood there asking about a sale that had seemed too ordinary to remember. That is the quiet difficulty again. Most of life is not recorded at the level a mystery later requires. A shopkeeper remembers a mood, not a face. A clerk remembers the bell, not the time. A neighbor remembers curtains, not whether the clock had struck. When the Vertin case turned ordinary life into evidence, ordinary life resisted, not out of malice, out of scale. Human days are too full to preserve themselves for future detectives. The investigators worked around that by layering small confirmations. A receipt time was matched to bank hours. A bank visit was matched to a teller's memory. A teller's memory was checked against a ledger. Each piece alone was weak. Together, some became stronger. You can see the method clearly in the better reports. The detectives were building little rafts of certainty on a wide, uncertain river, enough to stand for a moment, never enough to cross the whole distance. One such raft concerned the afternoon before the disappearance. The timeline for that day became relatively firm. A shop visit, a conversation with a neighbor, a telephone call from a relative, supper at home, and a light scene upstairs around 9. After that, the structure loosened. You can almost feel the line thinning on the page. The known day gives way to the unknown night, not sharply, but gradually, like ink fading at the end of a pen stroke. The upstairs light was confirmed by 2 witnesses, though neither saw who turned it on or off. A light tells you presence, perhaps, but not intention. It may indicate reading, packing, resting, searching for something, or simply a lamp left burning. Detectives noted it because they had to, and then they were careful not to overread it. You sit with that restraint again. The Vertin case is full of lamps and not enough illumination, which is a sentence the file itself seems to understand. Another relative recalled that a drawer upstairs had been found slightly open. The original search report did not mention it, and later photographs were inconclusive. Was the drawer open before? Did someone open it while looking for papers? Was the memory formed after years of talking through possibilities? No one could say. Yet the drawer appears in family recollection with surprising persistence, the way some small visual details do when grief has had years to polish them. You can see the drawer, but you cannot rely on it. Detectives handled that memory cautiously. They asked what was usually kept there. Gloves, scarves, personal letters, perhaps a small box of buttons. Nothing obviously missing, though missing from such a drawer can be difficult to define. The relative remembered a lavender scent from the lining paper. That scent appears nowhere in the official inventory, yet it lingers in the interview, making the room feel suddenly near. You breathe gently around it, because sensory memory can be vivid without being legally useful. There are many truths like that in old files. A smell can be true, a feeling can be true, a sense that something was off can be sincere. But investigations need a bridge from lived truth to demonstrable fact, and bridges are not always available. The Vertin case had plenty of sincere impressions. It had fewer bridges. Detectives could respect the impressions without pretending they carried the whole weight of proof. That distinction may be one of the reasons the case stayed open rather than falsely settled. The family's private papers were reviewed by consent during one of the later inquiries. Letters were read for possible unknown contacts, disputes, travel plans or appointments. The detective's notes are discreet, and ours should be too. Most of what was found belonged to ordinary family life. Invitations, bills, birthday wishes, mild complaints about weather, household repairs, and health. Nothing in those papers announced an answer. You can imagine the investigator turning pages slowly, aware that searching someone's letters is both necessary and intimate. One postcard did raise a question because it was signed with initials resembling those in the address book. The card had been sent from another town, months earlier, with a picture of a courthouse on the front. For a few days, perhaps longer, it must have seemed important. The handwriting was compared. The postmark was checked. The sender was identified as an older acquaintance with no apparent connection to the disappearance. The initials matched, but the meaning did not. Another near door, another quiet closing. Near matches can be especially tiring. They give the mind a shape to hold, then ask it to release the shape gently. Detectives in the Vertin case encountered them again and again. Names that nearly fit, cars that nearly matched, dates that nearly aligned, rumors that nearly had sources. You can feel why someone less careful might have forced one of those near matches into place. But a near match is not a match, and old cases are full of almost. Almost is a heavy word when it repeats across decades. Almost identified, almost traced, almost confirmed, almost remembered. It can make a file feel haunted by the shape of an answer. Yet the better detectives seem to treat almost as information, not failure. Almost tells you where the evidence wants to go but cannot. It helps map the boundary between possibility and proof. In the Vertin case, that boundary became one of the most carefully drawn lines in the whole record. At one point, a state investigator suggested creating a public appeal focused only on the unexplained initials, without mentioning the wider case details. The idea was to see whether anyone recognized the notation without being influenced by the story. A small notice ran in local papers and newsletters, asking about a set of letters that may have referred to a person, business, club, or route. Responses came slowly, in envelopes and phone messages. Most were guesses, some were thoughtful, none settled the matter. You can picture those responses arriving at the station, each one carrying a small human wish to help. A retired teacher suggested a school committee. A mechanic suggested a parts supplier. A woman from a nearby town suggested a boarding house, known by those initials, though it had closed before the relevant year. Detectives checked what they could. The initials remained stubbornly themselves. 2 or 3 marks on a page, light ink pressed into old paper, close enough to invite, far enough to refuse. The public appeal also revealed something else. People remembered the Vertin case through fragments, and each fragment had become central in a different household. One family spoke always of the depot, another of the pale car, another of the phone call, another of the address book. The town did not hold one version. It held a cluster of partial versions, like a drawer of old keys with no labels. Investigators had to listen to all of them without letting any single fragment pretend to be the whole. That is why topic re-anchoring mattered inside the file itself. Detectives repeatedly wrote Vertin at the top of working notes, even when the notes concerned only weather, directories, or vehicle records. The name kept the work attached to the person, and not merely to the puzzle. You see it in pencil, ink, type, and printed labels. Vertin, Vertin Inquiry, Vertin Review, Vertin Correspondence. The repetition is practical, but it is also a quiet act of remembrance. The name itself gathered weight over time. To the family, it was personal before it was a case. To the town, it became shorthand for uncertainty. To detectives, it became a file that resisted closure without ever becoming empty. You can feel those layers when you see the name on an old tab. The tab is small, the word is worn, yet behind it are rooms, streets, voices, weather, and years of people saying, perhaps this time, perhaps this lead, perhaps this page. One winter review began after a graduate student cataloging regional newspapers found a brief item that had not been clipped into the main file. It mentioned a woman asking directions near the bus station on the same morning, though the description was vague and the report unattributed. The clipping had been overlooked because it ran in a neighboring county paper, not the local one. You can hear the quiet stir this would have caused, not excitement exactly, but the careful lifting of heads around a table. The bus station had always been a secondary possibility, less developed than the rail depot. This clipping brought it back. Detectives compared schedules, routes, ticket records, and the distance from Hawthorne Street. They looked for old station employees, though most were gone. They searched for police logs from neighboring towns along the bus line. The work stretched over weeks. The paper smelled newer than the original file, but the questions smelled old, if questions can have a smell, like dust disturbed from a familiar shelf. The unattributed item proved difficult. No reporter's notebook survived. No source was named. The description may have come from a rumor already circulating after the first public notice. The bus schedules showed possible departures, but no passenger list. A driver remembered nothing in a later interview, and perhaps could not have been expected to. The bus station lead became another branch that grew leaves but no fruit. It shaded the file for a season, then let the light through again. Even so, the bus lead changed how investigators thought about the morning. It reminded them that the depot was not the only way out of town, and that people often remembered the most prominent landmark while forgetting smaller routes. It broadened the transportation question. Taxis, private cars, buses, trains, and walking paths were all re-examined. You can feel the map expanding beneath your hand, roads unfolding like creases in a well-used chart. The Vertin case had never been only one street. A taxi company ledger from that period was located in a private collection, which sounds more promising than it became. The ledger was incomplete, and drivers often wrote destinations loosely: station, square, east side, doctor, home. One entry on the relevant morning read simply H Street, and for a moment that letter carried enormous weight. Hawthorne Street, Hill Street, Hanover Road. The dispatcher's handwriting was cramped, and the fare amount was ordinary. Detectives tried to identify the driver, but he had died years before. The ledger was photographed and preserved. Handwriting specialists could not resolve the abbreviation. City directories showed several possible H locations. No payment record identified the passenger. You can feel the old frustration settle gently over the page. The taxi lead was not useless. It was another possible movement through town. But without more, it could not be tied to the Vertin household. The file gained a question and then had to carry it. Carrying questions is almost the job description of a cold case detective. You carry them without letting them crowd out the facts. You carry them through budget meetings, evidence inventories, family calls, and the ordinary work of other cases. You carry them after retirement. Sometimes, as the officer with the garage light memory did. The Vertin case seems to have been carried by many people in that way, each holding a portion, none holding enough. A newer detective once wrote that the case's difficulty lay in too many plausible exits from the known timeline. That phrase has a technical sound, but it is quietly profound. Too many plausible exits. The night could have led toward the depot. The morning could have led toward a private meeting. A car could have mattered. A phone call could have mattered. An ordinary errand could have turned into the last known movement. The timeline did not end at a locked door. It opened into several dim hallways. You can imagine standing at those hallways with the detective, not frightened, simply aware of the limits of the light. One hallway smells of train smoke and wet wood. One holds the rubber and oil scent of a garage. One carries the paper and ink smell of the post office. One is domestic, with lavender drawer liner and a cooling cup on the kitchen table. Each hallway has footprints at the entrance and uncertainty beyond. The Vertin case asks you to look, but not to pretend you can see farther than you can. That refusal to pretend may be the most compassionate part of the work. Families often deserve certainty, but investigators cannot manufacture it without causing another harm. The Vertin family through generations received updates that were honest about limits. This honesty may have hurt, but it preserved trust. You can feel that trust in later correspondence, where relatives send clippings, memories and questions without anger in every line. They knew the detectives had not cracked the case. They also knew some were still listening. Listening took many forms. One detective attended a small community meeting where older residents were invited to share memories of the case. The meeting was held in a library room with folding chairs, a coffee urn, and rain darkening the windows. People spoke softly. Some corrected one another. Some disagreed about dates. One person remembered the post office notice. Another remembered the search parties. Another remembered the search parties. Another remembered being told to come straight home from school. You can feel the case living as community memory. The detective did not treat the meeting as evidence in the strict sense. He treated it as orientation. It showed which stories had circulated, which details had fused together, and which rumors had no clear source. That kind of listening is archival in its own way. It preserves the difference between memory as testimony and memory as local atmosphere. The Vertin case had both, and confusing one for the other would have made the file less clear. After the meeting, several attendees stayed to look at a photocopied map. Fingers moved over streets. Someone traced the old route to the depot. Someone else pointed to where the bakery had been. Though the building now housed an insurance office, the map became a shared surface, a place where personal geography and official geography met. You can hear the paper crackle under their hands. You can smell coffee cooling in paper cups. Nothing was solved, but the town briefly remembered together. That kind of remembering has limits, yet it has value. It can bring forward a name. It can correct a landmark. It can show which rumors came from newspapers and which from direct experience. It can also give people a place to set down what they have carried. In the Vertin case, where the answer stayed hidden, setting down may have been one of the few mercies available. Detectives are not counselors. but their questions sometimes create room for grief to speak in orderly sentences. Orderly sentences were needed when the case was later submitted for external review by a regional cold case panel. The panel included investigators, forensic specialists, analysts, and an archivist. They did not arrive with a dramatic new theory. They arrived with checklists, timelines, evidence inventories, and the quiet skepticism of people trained to find gaps. You can picture them around a conference table, water glasses leaving rings on paper coasters, laptops open beside copies of reports written before any of them began their careers. The panel's findings were measured. They praised the preservation of key materials. They noted weaknesses in early documentation, especially around informal tips and property items. They recommended no broad public accusation, no narrowing to a single suspect, and no destructive testing until relevance could be better established. Such recommendations can sound disappointing, but they are also protective. The Vertin case did not need noise. It needed careful stewardship, and the panel understood that. One analyst rebuilt the contact network from the address book, family statements, and public records. Names became nodes on a chart, connected by household, work, church, business, and friendship. It looked complex, perhaps too complex, and the analyst cautioned against mistaking connection for significance. In a small town, everyone connects eventually. You can feel the wisdom in that warning. A web can reveal hidden relationships, but it can also make ordinary community look suspicious simply because lines can be drawn. The network did show a few names that had not been interviewed originally, mostly because they were peripheral and out of town. Later efforts found little. One had died, one had moved overseas, one remembered the family kindly but knew nothing. Another kept old diaries, which were reviewed with permission. The diaries mentioned weather, church suppers, a sick aunt, and the price of flour, but not the Vertin case until after it became public. Ordinary life again, recorded in small script across thin paper. Reading someone's diary for an investigation is delicate work. The panel noted that only relevant dates were reviewed, and copies were not retained beyond excerpts connected to the inquiry. That restraint belongs in our telling. It reminds us that old cases can reach into private corners, and reaching does not cancel the need for respect. You, as the quiet detective tonight, turn only the pages you must turn. You do not linger where the case gives you no reason to linger. The diaries did help with one small matter. They confirmed that the weather on the afternoon before the disappearance had cleared briefly, which matched a shopkeeper's memory of sunlight through the front window. This may seem minor, but it strengthened the timing of a shop visit and the route afterward. Again, the case moved by a fraction. A little sunlight entered a paragraph. A receipt found a better hour. A person's ordinary errand became more firmly placed in the last known day. The panel also asked whether the Vertin case might have suffered from case gravity, where one early theory pulls later interpretation toward itself. The depot theory may have done that. Because the depot sighting arrived early and seemed concrete, later tips were often measured against it, perhaps more than they deserved. This is not a criticism so much as a reminder. Early leads create grooves. Later thinking can run inside those grooves, even when another path might be worth walking. To counter that, the panel recommended reading the file backward. Start with later reviews, then move toward the original reports, so the mind does not inherit the first theory too quickly. You try that with them. The case feels different backward. The modern lab reports come first, cool and careful, then the cold case memos, then the family letters, then the original statements, which suddenly feel fresher and more fragile. Reading backward does not solve the Vertin case, but it loosens the hold of habit. Habit is powerful in investigation. A phrase repeated often begins to feel verified. A witness described as reliable stays reliable long after new context complicates that label. A lead once called promising keeps a glow around it. The Vertin case had been handled by enough people that language itself became part of the evidence environment. The panel suggested replacing inherited labels with source-based descriptions. Not strong depot sighting, but unconfirmed sighting by station witness. Later uncertainty noted. Less dramatic, more truthful. That change may seem small, but it alters the whole room. The depot lead no longer stands at the center with a bright lamp over it. It sits among other uncertain observations, still important, but less commanding. The pale car lead becomes a cluster of variable reports rather than a single object. The address book initials become an unresolved notation, not necessarily a secret. You can feel the file becoming less theatrical and more honest, which is exactly the tone a patient case deserves. From there, investigators re-examined what was truly missing from the household. The list had changed over time, partly because memories changed, and partly because items were found in unexpected places. Clothing, key case, papers, perhaps a small amount of cash. None could be established with perfect certainty. Family members disagreed gently. One remembered a dark hat, another said it had been stored away months earlier. A third thought the cash amount was never counted accurately. The Vertin case refused even its inventory a clean edge. Inventories depend on habit, and habit can be invisible until it breaks. You know your own drawer until someone asks you to prove what was inside it yesterday. You know where a coat usually hangs, but not whether it was moved before supper. You know cash was in a tin, perhaps, but not exactly how much. Detectives had to ask grieving people to turn invisible habits into lists, and those lists became evidence with all the softness and uncertainty that implies. The panel's archivist made a note about this softness. She wrote that the household inventory should be treated as memory-supported, not object-confirmed, except where photographs or property logs existed. It is a dry phrase, but useful. Memory-supported, not false, not firm, held up by people doing their best. Much of the Vertin case belongs in that category, and saying so clearly may be one of the kindest things the file can do for everyone who tried to help. The same archivist noticed several duplicate photographs with different crop marks. One showed more of the kitchen doorway than the commonly used print. In that wider frame, a small portion of the hallway table was visible, including what might be a dish or tray. For a brief time, investigators wondered whether the missing key case could have rested there. The original negative was examined. The image was too blurred to identify the object. The question remained, though now it had an image to haunt. You can see the blurred shape if you wish, but you need not make it into more than blur. That is another discipline. The mind loves to complete unclear images, especially when the file has asked the same question for years. A tray becomes a key case, a shadow becomes a glove, a reflection becomes a person. Detectives must look directly at ambiguity without letting desire sharpen it falsely. The Vertin case demanded that over and over. The wider photograph did, however, confirm the hallway table's position, which helped interpret one family statement about where keys were usually placed. A small gain, a table placed correctly, a habit understood slightly better. You can feel how such gains accumulate without breaking the case open. They make the map more faithful. They make the house more real. They give future readers less room to wander into error. In a file that never closed, faithfulness became its own kind of progress. Another set of documents concerns search efforts beyond town. Flyers were sent to stations, hospitals, boarding houses, and police departments across several counties. Copies of those flyers survive, their type slightly uneven, the ink darker at the edges of some letters. You can imagine them pinned to bulletin boards near ticket windows, curling slowly in dry indoor air. People may have glanced at them while buying tickets, tying scarves, or waiting for news of trains delayed by weather. The flyers used a description that later proved imperfect. A height estimate varied. Clothing details were uncertain. A personal item may have been listed as missing before anyone knew whether it truly was. These imperfections matter because they shaped what strangers looked for. If the scarf color was wrong, someone might have dismissed a possible sighting. If the height was off, a clerk might have hesitated. The Vertin case moved outward into the world through words that were themselves uncertain. This is not blame. Early flyers are written under pressure, with facts still forming. Better to ask quickly with imperfect information than wait for perfect information that may never come. Yet the consequences remain. The first public description becomes part of public memory. Later corrections rarely travel as far. You can feel how the case, once released into newspapers and notices, began to live a life partly outside the investigator's control. Newspaper coverage was mostly restrained, though some headlines pressed harder than the facts allowed. The original clippings have brittle edges now. You can hear them crackle if handled without care. Reporters asked questions detectives could not answer. Editors shortened cautious statements. Readers filled gaps with conversation. The Vertin case became, for a while, a public story, and public stories tend to prefer shape over uncertainty. Detectives had to work inside that pressure without letting it govern the file. One article misreported the time of the telephone call, placing it on the wrong evening. That error echoed in several later tips, making them difficult to evaluate. When a caller said she remembered hearing about the call that night, detectives had to ask which night she meant and whether her memory came from the article. You see how a small printed mistake can ripple. Ink dries quickly. Corrections do not always catch up. In the Vertin case, even the record around the record needed investigating. The department eventually issued a clarification, but the correction was printed smaller. That too is ordinary. The first version gets attention. The careful version gets a column inch. You can feel the detective's frustration, though the file does not raise its voice. They adjusted their interviews accordingly, asking witnesses whether they had read coverage before forming a memory. It is a subtle question, and an important one. Memory can absorb public detail so gently that the person no longer knows where the image began. Public detail may have affected the pale car reports as well. The first report described a light vehicle near the post office. Later reports, after the story spread, became more confident about a pale sedan, sometimes with details not present in the earliest notes. The cold case panel marked this as possible contamination, a harsh-sounding word for a very human process. People want to help. They listen. They imagine. They remember with the story already in the room. A careful investigator does not shame that process. He simply accounts for it. You can see the reports being ranked by proximity to the event and independence from publicity. Earlier, independent observations carried more weight. Later, story-shaped memories carried less. This ranking did not discard anyone's effort. It allowed the file to breathe in layers. The Vertin case needed those layers, because all memories were not equal, and pretending they were would have made the fog thicker. Sometimes the most reliable records were the least emotional ones. A fuel receipt, a train schedule, a weather report, a bank ledger. These did not care about the case, and that indifference made them useful. Yet they also lacked context. A receipt can tell you a time, but not a mood. A schedule can show a departure, but not a passenger's thought. The Vertin case required both kinds of knowing, the cold and the warm, the ledger and the living voice. You hold those together as you move deeper into the file. The bank ledger places a transaction. The teller recalls a calm manner. The receipt shows a shop visit. The shopkeeper remembers damp gloves on the counter. The weather report says light rain. The witness remembers hair flattened slightly by mist. None of these pieces alone is enough. Together, they create a small zone of presence, a last ordinary day assembled from paper, ink, and human attention. The last ordinary day deserves calm. It is tempting in mysteries to treat it as a prelude, but for the people living it, it was simply a day. There were errands, small irritations, perhaps a warm drink, perhaps tired feet, perhaps a glance at the sky to judge whether rain would hold. You, reading now, can let that day remain human. The Vertin case began not with mystery, but with normal life continuing until someone later realized the continuity had broken. That realization happened gradually. A missed appointment, a phone, unanswered, a neighbor's uncertainty, a family member checking one room, then another. The file records the sequence in practical terms, but beneath it you can feel the emotional shift from explanation to concern. At first there are reasons, perhaps delayed, perhaps visiting, perhaps forgot. Then reasons begin to thin. The ordinary world, which had explained so much, no longer explains enough. That is the quiet threshold where a missing person inquiry begins. Detectives entering at that threshold must do two things at once. They must act promptly, and they must avoid deciding too soon what kind of case it is. The Vertin case shows that tension clearly. Some early notes treat it as possible voluntary absence. Others treat it as suspicious. Others simply gather facts. This inconsistency can look messy from the future, but in the moment, it may have been honest. The case had not yet declared itself, and investigators were listening for its shape. The shape never fully declared itself. That may be the simplest answer to why detectives could never crack the Vertin case. It remained between categories, too concerning to dismiss, too uncertain to prove, too many details to ignore, too few decisive facts to resolve. It asked for action, then withheld direction. It gave investigators a street, a house, a phone call, possible sightings, and years of late-arriving memory. But it did not give them the one thing every case finally needs: a supported path from question to answer. Still, the work continued in supported fragments: a name checked, a route walked, a photograph enhanced, a witness treated gently, an envelope preserved. You can rest inside that rhythm. It is not dramatic, but it is deeply human. The detectives were not heroes in a bright story. They were workers at desks, walkers of damp streets, readers of old handwriting, keepers of uncertainty. The Vertin case did not reward them with closure, but it did reveal the moral patience of their craft. In a later training note, the case was used as an example of documentation challenges. Young investigators were shown how early uncertainty can multiply if not labeled clearly. They studied the shifting descriptions, the public notice, the telephone call error, and the ambiguous property list. In that way, the Vertin case taught people who would never work it directly. Its unanswered questions became lessons in careful wording, evidence preservation, and humility before memory. That is not closure, but it is not nothing. You can imagine a classroom with pale walls and a projector hum. The old case appearing on a screen before new detectives with clean notebooks. They see Hawthorne Street in black and white. They see the address book entry enlarged. They see the confidence-rated timeline. They learn that a phrase like "witness saw" may need to become "witness later reported possibly seeing." The difference is not mere caution. It is truthfulness, and truthfulness is the foundation on which any eventual answer would have to stand. One instructor reportedly told them that unsolved cases are not blank spaces. They are records of work, limits, and responsibility. That thought fits the Vertin case well. The file is full. It is not empty, because it lacks an ending. It contains care, effort, mistakes, corrections, and returns. You can feel the weight of it in your hands. Not as a burden meant to keep you awake, but as a quiet object that asks to be held properly before being set down. The case also taught the importance of preserving original uncertainty. Early reports sometimes polished uncertainty into smoother language than the notes supported. A witness who thought it might be became, in one summary, a witness who observed. Later reviewers had to walk that language back. You see why direct notes matter. The first rough phrasing, with all its hesitations, may be more valuable than a tidy summary. In the Vertin case, tidiness sometimes obscured the very caution that should have been preserved. That lesson reaches beyond one file. It tells us something about how humans tell stories. We smooth, we simplify, we seek beginnings, middles, and ends. But detective work, especially patient detective work, must resist smoothing until the evidence itself becomes smooth, and it may never do so. The Vertin case stayed rough. Its edges did not align. Its pages refused a clean stack. You can accept that roughness tonight, letting it be part of the truth, rather than a problem to solve. At the edge of the file, there are notes about unidentified callers who refused to leave names. Some offered vague claims. Some sounded distressed. Some may have been unwell. Some may have been pranksters, though the file avoids that word unless necessary. Each call was logged. Time, date, voice, content, background sounds. One had music playing faintly behind it. Another had traffic noise. Another ended after the caller asked whether the Vertin case was still open. You can hear the receiver returning to its cradle. Anonymous calls are difficult. They may hold something genuine or nothing at all. They invite imagination because the caller is absent from the page. Detectives tried to trace what they could, but most led nowhere. One caller mentioned a bridge outside town, prompting a search of old maintenance records and nearby property reports. Nothing connected. Another mentioned a blue suitcase, which did not match any reliable inventory. The Vertin case, by then known locally, attracted echoes as well as information. Echoes can be mistaken for voices. The investigators learned to ask whether a caller's detail had appeared in the press. If it had, the lead weakened. Maps appeared again when the county digital, with sidelines, with Cumfield the detective listening to a recording, if one existed, or reading a call log, trying to decide how much weight a frightened sentence should carry. There is no formula for that. One anonymous caller used a phrase that matched a family expression found in a letter. That briefly raised interest. Later, the phrase turned out to be common in the region, a saying about weather and late trains. The lead faded, but the process of checking it brought researchers into local speech patterns, which may sound far from a missing person file, yet language can matter. People reveal place, age, and social world in the phrases they use. The Vertin case made even speech a map. This was not because they expected a simple answer there. It was because landscapes change, and old possibilities can disappear under new construction. You can imagine overlaying maps on a screen, the past in thin lines over the present, roads shifting slightly like memory itself. The property review identified an alley behind the post office that had been open at the time but later closed by a building extension. Several early statements mentioned the back way without defining it. This alley may have been what they meant. Detectives marked it on the master map. Again, the case did not open, but movement through town became a little more understandable. A person could pass from the post office corner toward the depot without being visible from the main street for several minutes. Those several minutes are the kind of small space in which old mysteries often live, not hidden chambers, not grand conspiracies. Just an alley, a weather delay, a missed glance, a train whistle, a hedge, a wrong time in a newspaper, a memory softened by retelling. The Vertin case may have slipped through a combination of such spaces. You can feel how unsatisfying and plausible that is. The world does not need to be elaborate to become unclear. The alley also complicated the pale car sighting. If the car was parked near the post office, it may not have been connected to anyone entering the main doors. It could have waited near the alley, or it could have belonged to a customer, a postal worker, a delivery driver, a visiting relative, or someone with no relation at all. The more routes detectives identified, the more possibilities multiplied. Good information does not always narrow a case at once. Sometimes, it first reveals how wide the case truly was. That widening can discourage investigators, but it can also prevent false closure. Before the alley was understood, a theory might have assumed visibility from the post office window. Afterward, that assumption weakened. The case became harder, but truer. You and I can accept that for tonight. A harder truth is better than an easier mistake. The Vertin file seems to repeat that lesson until it becomes almost a lullaby of method. Harder, truer, slower, kinder. Kindness appears again in how later investigators handled former suspects. Some people had lived under quiet suspicion for years, not officially accused, but named in whispers. When reviews found no support for those theories, detectives noted that clearly. No evidence connecting, timeline inconsistent, rumor unsupported. These phrases may seem dry, but they can matter to living families. An old rumor can cling to a name long after the file has moved on. The Vertin case needed not only unanswered questions preserved, but weak accusations released. Releasing a weak accusation is a form of repair. It cannot undo years of talk, but it can make the official record cleaner. You see this in one memorandum addressing the traveling worker whose name nearly matched the initials. The memo states plainly that available evidence did not establish contact with the Vertin household or presence at relevant locations. It does not declare him impossible. It simply refuses to keep him in the center without cause. That restraint protects the investigation and the person. The same restraint applies to family tensions. Early reports mention disagreements, as most family histories would if examined closely enough. Later reviewers carefully separated ordinary conflict from evidence. A disagreement about money, a missed visit, a sharp word remembered after the fact. These things can become enlarged by fear, but they are common in human life. The Vertin case did not gain clarity by turning every imperfection into motive. It gained dignity by allowing people to remain whole, complicated, and not reduced to suspicion. You can feel why this matters for sleep. We are not here to sharpen every edge. We are here to sit with a difficult story without making it cruel. The people in the Vertin case were not characters built for mystery. They were residents of a town, keepers of habits, writers of letters, buyers of stationery, watchers of weather. The detective's patient work, at its best, remembered that. Our retelling should remember it too. Another box contains administrative correspondence about evidence storage fees, transfer forms, and chain of custody certifications. It sounds dull, and perhaps it is, but dullness can be protective. A signature in the right place means an envelope can still be trusted decades later. A storage note means a lab can understand what conditions an item endured. A transfer form means no one has to guess where the address book spent a missing year. In the Vertin case, paperwork kept the remaining possibilities from dissolving entirely. You run your eyes along those forms, and the names of custodians begin to form a second caste of caretakers, evidence clerks, records managers, archivists, supervisors who approved transfers, people who may never have interviewed a witness, yet helped keep the file alive. Cold casework is larger than the detective at the desk. It includes the person who notices a torn seal, the person who files a box correctly, the person who scans a brittle page before the corner breaks. One evidence clerk added a note in red ink, "Handle spine carefully." It referred to the green address book. Such a small instruction, such a human one. The book had become fragile, not only as evidence, but as an object. Its cracked spine needed care. Its pages could no longer be pressed flat. You can see the clerk lifting it with both hands, perhaps unaware of every theory attached to it, but fully aware that careless handling could take something from the future. That note may be one of the purest expressions of the Vertin case's later life. Handle spine carefully. Handle uncertainty carefully. Handle people carefully. The instruction expands without trying to. It tells us how to move through the file tonight. We do not force it open farther than it can go. We support it, read what it offers, and let the rest remain unbroken. There is peace in that method, even without an answer. The next correspondence concerns a request from a documentary producer many years ago, which the department declined in part because the case remained open and the family had concerns. The letter is polite. It thanks the producer for interest, then explains limits. This too belongs in the patient history of the case. Public attention can help, but it can also flatten, dramatize, or disturb. The Vertin case, quiet and uncertain, may not have been ready for a louder room. Instead, the file stayed mostly with investigators and family, emerging only for careful appeals. That privacy shaped its memory. It did not become a famous national riddle. It remained a local absence, known deeply by some and barely by others. You can feel the difference. Famous cases gather layers of speculation like dust on a public statue. Lesser-known cases gather dust in actual boxes, waiting for someone to open them with clean hands and enough time. The Vertin case may have suffered from that modest profile, because fewer eyes meant fewer chances for recognition. It may also have benefited, because less noise meant fewer false leads. There is no perfect balance. Investigators considered broader publicity at several points and chose limited releases. Each decision had trade-offs. You can respect the difficulty there. A public appeal can reach the one person who knows. It can also awaken 100 people who only think they do. The family's wishes weighed heavily. Some wanted renewed attention. Others feared sensational treatment. Both positions make sense. When a case has been open for many years, hope and fatigue can live in the same household. One person wants every possible question asked again. Another wants quiet protected. Detectives had to navigate that tender ground while remembering that the case did not belong to public curiosity. It belonged first to the missing, the affected, and the truth, however hidden. In one letter, a family representative wrote that they wanted answers, but not spectacle. That sentence could stand over the entire Vertin case. Answers, not spectacle. It is the same spirit we keep here. We let the lamp stay low. We let the facts move at their own speed. We do not turn uncertainty into entertainment. We notice the investigators waiting, the family's endurance, the witnesses' imperfect kindness, and the ordinary town that became the setting for a question it never fully answered. The case file, as preserved, contains no single confession, no definitive forensic result, no recovered object that transforms the story. It contains instead a long record of disciplined incompleteness. That phrase may sound severe, but there is something almost restful in its honesty. Disciplined incompleteness means the gaps are named, the uncertainties are labeled, the weak leads are marked weak, the possible leads remain possible. The file does not pretend to be whole, and because it does not pretend, it can still be trusted. You can carry that thought into the next page, where the master timeline continues in neat rows. Each row has a source, confidence level, and note. Some rows are full, others are sparse. The confirmed events feel like stepping stones. The possible events feel like reflections of stones underwater. You place your attention on one, then another, moving gently, never needing to cross the whole stream at once. The Vertin case becomes bearable when taken this way, one careful row at a time. A row near the middle notes the last verified outgoing letter from the household. It was mailed 2 days before the disappearance and concerned a cousin's visit planned for later that month. The letter was ordinary, affectionate, and practical. It mentioned weather, a recipe, and a small repair needed near the back steps. Nothing in it suggested departure or danger. Detectives read it many times, perhaps hoping ordinary words might disclose an extraordinary shadow. They did not. The letter remained what it was. That may be important in its own quiet way. Not every document hides a clue. Some documents simply show a life continuing. A planned visit suggests expectation. A recipe suggests domestic attention. A note about steps suggests the future assumed its usual shape. You can feel the tenderness in that. The Vertin case did not begin in a world already darkened by certainty. It began in a world where someone still thought about repairs, meals, and guests yet to arrive. The cousin's later statement confirms the visit was expected. She had received the letter, placed it on her mantle, and only later realized it might be among the last written words. She kept it for years in an envelope lined with tissue. When detectives asked to examine it, she agreed, but asked that it be returned. They photographed it, noted the postmark, and gave it back. The file preserves the content, but not the object, because some things belong at home if they can remain there. That distinction feels right. Evidence and keepsake can overlap, but they are not the same. The letter had investigative value, but it also had emotional gravity. Detectives treated it as borrowed, not seized, and that matters. The Vertin case asked many people to share private remnants. The least the investigation could do was treat those remnants with care. You can imagine the cousin smoothing the envelope after it was returned, the paper making a faint whisper under her fingers. The postmark on that letter helped establish the timing of the last routine errands. It confirmed that someone had been near the post office before the day in question, which complicated one witness's memory of seeing a similar coat there later. The witness may have merged days. This is common. Errands, repeat. Coats, repeat. Streets, repeat. Memory sometimes stores pattern more readily than date. Detectives adjusted the weight of the post office sighting accordingly, not discarding it fully, but lowering its certainty. Lowering certainty became a frequent action in later reviews. It sounds negative, but it is clarifying. A lead lowered from likely to possible frees the investigation from leaning too hard on it. A possible detail can still be watched. It simply does not carry the roof. In the Vertin case, several old beams were found too weak for the weight once placed upon them. The structure did not collapse. It became more honest about what truly supported it. The strongest supports remained modest. The last confirmed contacts, the physical file, the preserved address book, the contemporaneous reports, and the absence of any verified later trace. Absence is difficult evidence. It is both powerful and incomplete. No confirmed bank activity. No confirmed travel record. No confirmed communication. No confirmed sighting after the early uncertain ones. Each absence narrows the world, but absence does not explain itself. You can feel its quiet pressure in the file, like a room where the clock has stopped. Detectives searched for later traces many times. Marriage records, employment records, hospital admissions, unidentified person reports, border crossings where available, old pension files, newspaper mentions, cemetery records. Each search returned nothing or nothing reliable. You might imagine a long hallway of cabinets, each drawer opened and closed with care. The sound is repetitive, almost soothing, though the meaning is not. Open, check, note, close. The Vertin case moved through bureaucracy like a soft footstep through dust. No later trace meant several theories weakened. It made voluntary long-term disappearance harder to support, though not impossible. It made accidental misidentification in another town harder to verify. It left open the possibility that the answer lay near the original place and time, where records were thinnest. Investigators wrote these implications cautiously. They knew absence can mislead. People can live under changed names. Records can be lost. But when decades of searching find nothing, nothing becomes part of the room. You sit with that nothing without making it absolute. It is a quiet, heavy presence. Not a fact that explains, but a fact that limits. The Vertin case contains many such limits. Limits of sight, limits of memory, limits of paper, limits of technology, limits of human courage, perhaps, if someone knew more than they ever said. Limits of luck. Detectives worked along those boundaries, not because boundaries are satisfying, but because knowing where they are is the beginning of honest work. One late theory suggested that the answer might lie in a misfiled report from another jurisdiction. This happens more often than people think. Names are misspelled. Descriptions are incomplete. A person found in one place may not be connected to a missing report elsewhere, especially in older eras. Investigators submitted comparisons to wider databases when those became available. Potential matches were reviewed and excluded. Each exclusion was painful in one sense and merciful in another. It removed a possibility while leaving the main question untouched. The misspelling issue mattered because Vertin itself was sometimes written incorrectly in early correspondence. Vertin, Vertin, Vertin. Each variation was searched. You can see lists of alternate spellings in the file, the name branching into small errors made by clerks, callers, and distant offices. A single wrong letter can separate one record from another for years. The cold case team understood this and searched phonetically, visually, regionally. The name, like the case, had to be approached from more than one angle. Those searches found unrelated families, unrelated notices, unrelated records that briefly quickened the pulse and then settled. A cemetery record with a similar name, a hospital admission with a transcription error, a directory listing that belonged to a business, not a person. Each was checked. Each was set aside. You can feel the calm persistence required to do that without becoming numb. The file asks you to care about each possibility long enough to test it, then release it when it cannot carry weight. Release is an underrated part of investigation. Holding everything forever makes a file impossible to move through. Releasing too quickly risks losing the answer. The Vertin case lived between those dangers. Its best caretakers wrote enough to show why a lead was released, so future investigators could understand the decision rather than repeat it blindly. That is another form of kindness across time. A memo written for someone not yet present. A note left like a light in an archive. The archive itself becomes almost a character by the later pages. Temperature logs, access records, preservation sleeves, digitization notes. The case, once an urgent matter of streets and calls, becomes also a matter of storage and retrieval. This may sound like fading, but it is actually endurance in another form. A case cannot be solved by a future method if it has not survived into the future. The Vertin file survived because people made mundane, careful choices over and over. You can feel the temperature of that archive room now. Cool enough that your hands might want the warmth of a mug. Quiet enough that paper sounds louder than it should. Light kept gentle. Boxes aligned on shelves. A rolling ladder nearby. Somewhere, a dehumidifier hums with patient indifference. The Vertin case rests there, among many others, each with its own name, its own silence, its own people waiting behind the label. When an investigator pulls the Vertin box down, the past does not rush out. It arrives slowly. A label, a seal, a form, a photograph, a page. The order matters. The slowness matters. It gives the mind time to remember that this is not a puzzle for entertainment, but a record of an absence that changed lives. You, tonight, are allowed to move slowly too. There is no prize for reaching the end quickly. The file has waited decades. It can wait for your breathing. The next item in the correspondence folder is a note from a records technician about digitized newspapers becoming searchable. She had set an alert for several spellings of Vertin, plus the initials from the address book. The alert produced many irrelevant results, but occasionally a useful one. This is modern patience, not a detective at a rainy corner, but a search query running quietly in the background, month after month, waiting for some newly scanned page to bring forward a forgotten line. Most alerts were false. Advertisements, birth notices, business names, optical character errors where one word looked like another. Still, each alert was reviewed, because the cost of missing the right one was higher than the inconvenience of reading the wrong ones. You can imagine the technician opening results with a cup of tea beside the keyboard, the screen casting a pale rectangle of light, the old name appearing amid columns of unrelated text. Even digital searching has its own quiet dust. One result found a civic club roster containing initials that matched the address book and a surname not previously connected. The roster dated from the right general period. It came from a town along one of the bus routes. Investigators followed it. The person was identified, then traced through census records, employment records, and surviving relatives. He had no known link to the Vertin household, but he traveled for business and owned a light-colored car. For a time, the file leaned toward him. This lead had more shape than most. It connected initials, travel, vehicle, and geography. Detectives built a careful profile, avoiding assumptions. They located a photograph. They compared age and description with witness statements. They searched for business records showing visits to the town. They asked surviving relatives about old route books, invoices, appointment calendars. You can feel the team working with renewed attention, yet still keeping their hands light, because a promising lead can become dangerous if touched too eagerly. The relatives were cooperative, but unsure. They remembered a salesman's case, a neat handwriting style, a habit of sending postcards, and a tendency to keep appointments in small pocket calendars. Most calendars were gone. One surviving notebook covered a later year and showed routes through several counties, but not the relevant period. The photograph showed a face that could not meaningfully be compared to any witness description. The light-colored car was confirmed but common. The lead remained possible, then began to thin. A business ledger finally weakened it further. The man appeared to have been in another county during the critical days. Though the record was not perfect, an invoice placed him 70 miles away the afternoon before. A hotel register, found in a county archive, placed someone with his name there that night. The signature matched later examples closely enough. Detectives marked the lead as unlikely, not impossible, because old records can be wrong, but unlikely enough to step away. Another careful release. You can feel the disappointment more strongly here, perhaps because the lead had gathered so many threads. Initials, travel, car, route, all the right shapes nearly. But nearly is not enough. The Vertin case had taught that already, and still the lesson had to be learned again. The detective's memo is professional, but one line near the end says, "No further evidence supports continued focus." That is the sound of a door not slammed, simply eased closed. The alert system remained active. Years later, it found a classified advertisement from the week after the disappearance. The advertisement offered a used suitcase for sale, initials stamped near the handle. Because one anonymous caller had once mentioned a blue suitcase, investigators checked it. The seller was identified through an old phone number and city directory. The suitcase had belonged to a college student, unrelated. The color was brown. The initials did not match. The lead dissolved almost before it formed. Even such brief dissolving has a place in the file. It shows that investigators did not ignore a possible echo merely because it sounded unlikely. It also shows the risk of old anonymous details. A blue suitcase can attach itself to any later suitcase. Like a burr catching fabric, the file must remove it gently each time. You can almost see the detective writing the note, not irritated, just thorough, because thoroughness is how one keeps faith with a case that gives little back. The Vertin case also drew occasional comparisons to other regional disappearances, though none held firmly. Similar time period, similar transportation routes, similar uncertainty, but comparison can mislead if it ignores context. The cold case panel reviewed several and found no evidentiary connection. They noted differences in age, circumstances, geography, and last confirmed movements. That work matters because unsolved cases often attract one another in imagination. The mind wants a pattern large enough to explain many silences at once. Sometimes patterns are real. Sometimes they are only the mind's way of asking for relief. The investigators could not assume either. They compared carefully, then stepped back. In the Vertin case, no broader pattern was supported. It remained its own silence, not folded into another. You can feel the loneliness of that, but also the clarity. A case deserves its own shape unless evidence truly joins it to something else. A particularly gentle note appears in a family update after these comparisons were reviewed. The detective explains that no credible connection was found to other cases, and that the inquiry remains focused on the known Vertin facts. He avoids giving false comfort. He avoids frightening speculation. He writes in plain language with respect. You can imagine the letter being read at a kitchen table, perhaps with glasses set beside it, perhaps with someone folding it along the original crease afterward. Letters like that are part of the emotional record. They show how the official world speaks to private endurance. Too much detail can burden. Too little can feel dismissive. The right balance is hard. In the Vertin case, several detectives seem to have understood that families do not need every theory. They need honesty, effort, and care. They need to know the file has not been reduced to a box number in a cold room. And yet it is also a box number in a cold room. That is the strange dual nature of cold cases. Deeply personal, administratively stored, full of longing, tracked by barcode. You can hold both truths. The barcode helps the box be found. The longing explains why finding it matters. The Vertin case lives between those worlds, and patient detective work is the act of moving respectfully from one to the other without losing the person inside the system. As the pages continue, you notice fewer new facts and more reflections by investigators on what could still be done. Review transportation records if new archives open. Recheck initials against expanded databases. Preserve untested samples. Maintain family liaison. Reassess public appeal strategy. Each recommendation is a small seed placed in dry soil. Some may never grow. Some may wait for rain. The file does not know which. It only records that someone thought to plant them. The metaphor is gentle, but the work is practical. Cold case units depend on such recommendations because staff changes. Memories within departments fade. A detective who knows why a lead matters may retire, and without notes, the lead's meaning retires too. The Vertin case benefited from those who wrote for the future. You can see them thinking beyond themselves, leaving explanations, cautions, and next steps in language, clear enough for hands not yet on the box. One caution reads, "Do not contact family regarding initials unless independent significance established." That sentence protects people from unnecessary emotional disturbance. It recognizes that every inquiry can reopen waiting. Detectives may grow accustomed to uncertainty, but families experience each new question differently. The Vertin case had been reopened enough times that care around contact became part of the method. You can feel the compassion in restraint, the choice not to ring a phone until there is something real enough to justify the sound. A phone ringing in a family home can carry decades with it. It may be a detective. It may be nothing. It may be hope, or another explanation of why hope must wait. The investigators knew this. Their notes around family contact are unusually careful. Call after 4, speak with designated relative, avoid speculation, offer written follow-up. These are procedural details, but they are also kindness converted into practice. The Vertin case needed that conversion, because good intentions alone are not enough. The same care shaped public records requests. Some documents were withheld or redacted to protect private family information, while core investigative facts remained available for review. Balancing transparency and privacy is not simple. Too much secrecy can starve a case of outside help. Too much openness can turn personal sorrow into public possession. The Vertin case sat in that balance for years, and each generation of investigators adjusted the line with the tools and norms they had. You can see the broader history of detective work in those adjustments. Early files assume certain things need not be explained. Later files document more carefully. Modern reviews think about trauma, contamination, preservation, and database compatibility. The Vertin case did not change, exactly, but the world around it learned new ways to look. Each new way brought possibilities and limits. The old mystery remained old, but the questions asked of it became more refined. Refinement can be mistaken for progress, though it is not always the same. A better question may still receive no answer. A cleaner timeline may still end in darkness. A preserved sample may still fail to yield a profile. The Vertin case improved in clarity without resolving in fact. You can let that distinction remain. It is honest. It is also, in a strange way, restful, because it releases us from expecting every careful act to produce a revelation. Some careful acts simply keep faith. Faith, here, does not mean certainty. It means continuing to treat the unknown as worthy of responsible attention. The detectives who returned to the Vertin file practiced that kind of faith. So did the relatives who saved letters. So did the witnesses who admitted uncertainty rather than embroidering memory. So did the archivist who marked the fragile spine. Each person kept a small part of the case from being lost, even though none could make it whole. The file's most recent notes include a digital preservation checksum, a string of characters meant to verify that scanned records have not changed. It is a very modern kind of trust. Where earlier detectives relied on signatures and seals, later caretakers rely on hashes, backups, and controlled access logs. You do not need the technical details tonight. It is enough to notice the continuity. Every era invents its own way of saying, "This record is still here," and we have tried to keep it true. There is something soothing in that continuity. Paper to microfilm, microfilm to scan, scan to archive, archive to search, search to review, review back to paper, sometimes because a printed page under a lamp can still reveal what a screen makes easy to skim. The Vertin case has passed through all those forms, and in each form it remains itself. A question with a name, a place, a house, a street, and people who waited for more than the file could give. You may find as the night deepens that the case no longer feels like something to crack by force. It feels like something to accompany. We accompany the first detectives on the wet street. We accompany the family through letters and interviews. We accompany the cold case team into the archive. We accompany the evidence clerk holding the address book. We accompany the unanswered initials. Not because they are alive, but because attention can keep even ink from disappearing into mere mark. Attention is gentle when it does not demand too much. You can place it on the green address book now, resting on a clean table under controlled light. The cover is worn where fingers once held it. The corners are softened. The pages have a faint unevenness from age and pressure. Somewhere inside, the initials remain. They are neither clue nor coincidence with certainty. They are simply there, and being there, they keep asking to be understood. What would understanding look like? Perhaps a name matched by independent record. Perhaps proof of an appointment. Perhaps a letter found in an attic, mentioning a meeting no one else knew about. Perhaps a vehicle log. Perhaps a family memory, offered late but anchored to a document. Or perhaps understanding would look like the opposite. Proof that the initials were mundane. A shop code, a reminder, a private shorthand unrelated to the disappearance. Either answer would matter, because either would remove one layer of fog. The same is true of the phone call. A future discovery might identify it, or it might show that it belonged to an ordinary matter, unrelated but badly timed. The call's importance has always rested on context, and context remains incomplete. You can hear the old receiver in your mind, black and heavy, the cord curved against the wall, the voice low and polite, the memory of that voice held by someone who never expected it to become part of a file. A minute can echo for decades. Echo is a good word for much of the Vertin case. The original event is gone. What remains are echoes in paper, memory, objects, and place. Detectives listen to echoes, knowing that sound can distort as it travels. They do not dismiss it for that reason. They account for distance. They ask what surface reflected it, what wall softened it, what later noise mixed with it. Patient investigation is, in part, the art of listening to echoes without mistaking them for the original sound. The town itself echoed too. Hawthorne Street held the case differently as years passed. New families moved in. Children grew up without knowing why. Older residents sometimes mentioned the name quietly. The post office changed its windows. The depot platform weathered and was repaired. The alley behind the post office disappeared beneath new construction. Yet the old maps preserved the earlier shape. You can feel how a place can forget physically while remembering socially, and how detectives must read both kinds of memory. A later investigator took photographs from the same approximate angles as the originals. The comparison set is strangely moving. Then and now, fence and no fence, lilac and no lilac, old siding and newer paint. The road smoother, the sightline changed. The photographs cannot return the old morning, but they show what time has done. You can sit with them, like paired pages in a quiet album, noticing loss without dramatizing it. Time is always one of the main actors in a cold case. Time removes witnesses. Time changes streets. Time damages paper. Time improves science. Time softens anger. Time hardens rumor. Time gives perspective. Time takes opportunity. The Vertin case was shaped by all of these movements. Detectives could never work outside time. They could only work with what time had left and what time had newly made possible. That is why each review feels both hopeful and late, both fresh and dependent on fragile remnants. One of the oldest remaining witnesses gave a final interview in her 90s. The recording is brief. Her voice is thin but steady. She says she no longer trusts the image of the pale car, though she still remembers the feeling that the morning was unusual. The detective thanks her, and there is a pause where neither speaks. You can hear a clock ticking in the background. That pause may be one of the most honest moments in the file. Not knowledge, not proof, only two people respecting the limits of memory. Afterward, the detective wrote that the witness should not be contacted again, unless essential. Another small mercy. There comes a point when asking again is no longer useful and may no longer be kind. The Vertin case had asked enough of her. Her uncertainty was recorded. Her effort was honored. The file moved on without demanding that her mind yield what age had taken or transformed. Patient work includes knowing when patience means stopping. Stopping a particular line is not stopping the case. It is pruning, perhaps, though we keep the image soft. A lead that can no longer grow is marked accordingly. Energy shifts elsewhere. The case remains alive by not spending itself endlessly in exhausted places. You see this in modern review plans, where each possible action is weighed for likely value, emotional cost, evidence risk, and resource demand. Cold case work can sound romantic from a distance, but up close it requires careful triage. Triage is a practical word, and maybe a heavy one, but it belongs. Departments have many open files, families waiting in many directions, evidence rooms full of names. A detective, choosing to spend a week on the Vertin initials, is also choosing not to spend that week elsewhere. The file does not dwell on this, but it is real. Patient detective work is also responsible allocation. Care must be organized, or it burns itself out. The Vertin case survived because care became organized enough to last. That organization appears in spreadsheets now, though the old folder remains. Rows, tags, status fields, review dates, Evidence identifiers. The modern tools can feel cold, but they help memory persist beyond any one person. You can imagine the case name glowing softly on a screen, Vertin, beside fields marked open, inactive lead pending, evidence retained. It is not poetic, yet it means someone can find the case tomorrow. Someone can know what to do next. Systems, too, can be instruments of care. Still, there is something the screen cannot replace. The physical file carries pressure marks, paper tone, ink differences, paperclip stains, and the order in which earlier hands arranged things. A scan may preserve content, but the box preserves presence. Detectives who worked the Vertin case often used both. They searched digitally, then returned to the table. They enlarged images, then held photographs under angled light. They read typed transcripts, then listened to voice. The file had to be approached through more than one sense. That sensory approach matters because old evidence is material. A page can reveal indentation. A photograph can show cropping. A folder can show which documents were repeatedly handled. A brittle edge can tell you what was copied later. The Vertin case, quiet as it is, lives in these material clues about its own history. Not clues to what happened, necessarily, but clues to how people looked, missed, returned, and tried again. The investigation itself left traces, and those traces deserve reading. One heavily handled photograph is the depot awning. Its corners are more worn than the others. That tells you many eyes rested there, perhaps too many. The depot theory drew attention early and kept it. The worn corners are almost a physical record of investigative gravity. You can see why later reviewers made clean copies and placed the original away. Even looking can wear an object down. That is a quiet truth of archives and of memory. The Hawthorne Street photographs are less worn, except for the gate image. The gate latch, the mark, the angle toward the street. Investigators returned there too. The photograph shows ordinary wood and metal, a latch made important by context. You can feel the texture of chipped paint under a thumb. You can imagine cold metal in damp air. The file does not say whether the latch mattered, and perhaps it did not. But for years it received the attention people give to things that might have been touched at the edge of the unknown. Touch is complicated in old cases. Everyone touches ordinary objects. Family, visitors, officers, neighbors, time. A latch touched daily cannot easily tell you who passed through on one morning. A cup on a table may hold prints that mean nothing. An address book handled for years may carry a household's whole life on its pages. Detectives have to ask not only what can be found, but whether finding it would explain anything. The Vertin case repeatedly answered, "Not enough." Not enough became a refrain, though no one wrote it that way. Not enough to identify. Not enough to exclude. Not enough to charge. Not enough to close. Those words can sound bleak, but in the file, they are part of responsible restraint. Better not enough than too much claimed. Better an open file than a false certainty. You can rest with that, even if it is unsatisfying, because integrity sometimes leaves a story unfinished rather than finishing it wrongly. The legal threshold mattered throughout. Detectives may have believed certain things privately, but belief is not the same as a case that can be carried forward. They needed admissible evidence, reliable witnesses, coherent timelines, and proof that could survive challenge. The Vertin case offered fragments that could inspire belief, but not enough that could stand under formal weight. That distinction is essential. It is one reason the case could remain actively cared for and still never become resolved. When people ask why detectives could never crack it, they may imagine one missing clue. But the file suggests something broader. The Vertin case lacked convergence. The clues did not gather tightly enough around one explanation. They remained dispersed across telephone, street, station, car, book, household, and memory. Each area had its own uncertainty. None could pull the others into a firm center. The case was not a locked safe with one combination. It was a scattered set of quiet rooms, each missing a lamp. And yet detectives kept bringing small lamps. A lab test, a map overlay, a witness re-interview, a newspaper search, a directory alert, a family letter. None lit the whole house. Some lit a corner. Some showed that a corner was empty. Some revealed dust where people had imagined footprints. This is the real pace of patient work. Not one beam, but many small lights, carried by different hands across years. You may feel your attention softening now, and that is all right. The Vertin file is patient. If your eyes close for a moment, the pages remain where they are. The address book stays under its sleeve. The depot photograph rests in its folder. The map keeps its old streets. The rain in memory keeps touching the pavement. We can return to any page and find it waiting, unchanged except by our own improved gentleness. That improved gentleness may be the only gift a retelling can offer. We cannot solve what the file itself does not solve. We can avoid making it harsher. We can keep the people human. We can let uncertainty remain uncertainty. We can show the work as it was, slow, imperfect, sincere, constrained, and sometimes quietly noble. The Vertin case does not need thunder. It needs a low voice, a steady lamp, and enough time for every fragile detail to be handled without pressure. In the next pocket of the folder, you find copies of property tax maps. Their thin lines showing lots, alleys, sheds, and easements from the relevant year. The paper is newer, printed from old records, but the lines carry the older town. You trace Hawthorne Street with your eyes, then the post office corner, then the route toward the depot and the bus station. The geometry seems simple until you place people inside it. Then weather, errands, sightlines, and hesitation make the map breathe. One shed behind a vacant lot drew attention because it stood near a possible route and was demolished before the first major review. Original search notes do not mention it specifically. Did searchers check it? Was it locked? Was it already empty? The records do not say. Later investigators found a building permit, a demolition date, and the name of an owner who had long since died. They interviewed descendants, who remembered only that the shed stored tools and broken furniture. Nothing connected. The shed became another example of time removing the physical world before questions were ready. By the time anyone asked carefully, the boards were gone, the ground leveled, and a small office building stood in its place. You can imagine the detective looking at the modern site, traffic passing behind him, knowing that even perfect attention now could not recreate what was missed or undocumented then. That is not melodrama. It is simply one of the hard facts of delayed review. Search documentation in the early file was uneven. Some areas were listed by street, others by landmark. Some volunteer searches were summarized in broad terms. This was not unusual for the era, but it created later uncertainty. A field searched might mean walked along the road, checked thoroughly, or merely viewed from the edge. The Vertin case made later investigators ask what the word searched truly meant in each note. A single word, once assumed clear, became a room of its own. Words like that appear often: checked, cleared, known, seen, missing, usual. Each seems simple until the file leans on it. Checked by whom and how? Cleared on what basis? Known to whom? Seen in what light? Missing compared with what inventory? Usual according to whose habit? The Vertin case teaches you to slow down inside ordinary words. They are the hinges of reports, and if a hinge is loose, the door may not open where you think it does. A modern reviewer created a glossary for the case file, defining how current investigators should use inherited terms. This may sound excessive, but it helped. Citing required a direct visual report. Possible citing meant resemblance without certainty. Lead exhausted meant reasonable, available steps completed. Not that the matter could never be reopened. Such care with language made the Vertin file easier to share across agencies. It also made it kinder to the truth, which had suffered enough from vagueness. The glossary is not dramatic, but it may be one of the most useful documents in the later file. It prevents old confusion from reproducing itself. It lets a new detective enter without inheriting every blurred phrase. You can feel the quiet relief in that. A well-defined word is a clean tool. The Vertin case had many dull tools early on, through no one's special fault. Later caretakers sharpened what they could, even when the material they cut remained resistant. Resistance is a word we can use softly here. The case resisted because facts were incomplete, not because it had a will. It resisted because the past is not fully recoverable. It resisted because every explanation needed more support than the file could provide. You can feel that resistance under your fingertips, like a drawer that opens only halfway. You do not yank it. You look inside as far as you can, note what is visible, and leave room for someone later to repair the slide. One repair came through better family genealogy, not forensic genealogy, but ordinary family tree work. Investigators identified distant relatives who had inherited papers from branches once thought unrelated to the case. Most papers were personal and irrelevant. One envelope contained a holiday card from the Vertin household, with a return address written in the same hand as the address book. That helped handwriting comparison, though it did not identify the initials. Another small lamp, another corner lit. The holiday card also confirmed a habit of abbreviating certain names, using initials for close acquaintances in casual notes. This made the address book initials more likely to be personal shorthand, though not necessarily significant. The detail was added to the file with caution. It changed probability slightly, not destiny. You can see the note placed beside earlier handwriting reports. The folder becoming a conversation across decades. One analyst asks, another answers partly. A third adds a caveat. The case thinks slowly through many hands. That slow thinking is one reason long-form retelling suits the Vertin case. A quick account would flatten it into unresolved clues. A patient account lets you feel the labor between them. The days spent verifying a garage ledger, the weeks waiting for an archive response, the years before a newspaper became searchable, the minutes during which an elderly witness tries to decide whether her memory is memory or story. The case is not only what happened, it is what people did afterward. And what they did afterward was continue, imperfectly and carefully. They wrote, called, checked, preserved, corrected, apologized, revised, and sometimes waited. Waiting appears throughout the file in ways easy to miss. Waiting for lab capacity, waiting for a relative's reply, waiting for records to be released, waiting for a witness to feel well enough, waiting for technology to improve, waiting for a lead to become either stronger or kind enough to fade. The Vertin case is made of waiting almost as much as evidence. Waiting can be active. It can mean protecting an item from destructive testing. It can mean keeping a phone number current. It can mean setting a database alert and reviewing every false hit. It can mean not calling a family until there is something worth saying. It can mean allowing an uncertain witness to rest. You can let that idea settle. In a world that often values speed, the Vertin case reminds us that some care is measured by the willingness not to rush. The next page is a preservation request for the original negatives. Several had been stored separately, which likely saved detail lost in printed copies. A technician scanned them at high resolution, then adjusted contrast to examine shadows near the gate, the hallway, and the depot awning. The enhancements were useful for orientation, but they did not reveal a hidden figure, a readable plate, or the missing object some had hoped for. The negatives gave more detail, not the answer. More detail without answer can be both gift and ache. You see the grain of the road surface. You see raindrops on a window. You see the gate latch more clearly, the chipped paint like small islands of pale wood. You see the depot sign, the dark underside of the awning, the wet boards of the platform. The world becomes sharper, yet the central question remains soft. The Vertin case, again, lets you approach closely without letting you arrive. Arriving is not promised in this work. Detectives know that, though families may still hope, and hope is not foolish. Hope is a human way of facing a long silence. But professional hope must be disciplined. It must be willing to say, "This lead failed. This test is inconclusive. This theory is unsupported. This evidence should wait." The Vertin case seems to have survived best when hope and discipline sat together, neither one allowed to overrule the other. There is a small handwritten note clipped to the negative scan report. It says, "Good for map update only." That is all the enhanced images could provide. They helped update the map. In another kind of story, that would feel disappointing. In this one, it feels fitting. The case gives a little. The investigators accept a little. The map improves. The mystery remains. You can breathe with that rhythm, because it asks nothing sudden of you. Map updates led to a refined reconstruction of the walk from the Vertin house to several key points. Investigators marked estimated travel times under different weather conditions and walking speeds. They included stops at the post office, the alley, the depot, the bus station, and a taxi stand. The reconstruction showed that several reported sightings could not all be true unless times were wrong, which they may have been. It clarified the problem without solving it. Again, the file became more honest. Time estimates from witnesses were especially vulnerable. Few people looked at clocks before they knew a clock mattered. A woman saying around 7 may mean any time between 10 before and 20 after. A shop opening at 7:30 may have opened late in rain. A train whistle remembered just before. A sighting may have been the earlier freight or the later passenger line. The Vertin case lived inside those elastic minutes, and elastic minutes do not make firm bridges. The reconstruction used ranges rather than single times. This was a major improvement. Instead of forcing the morning into a narrow line, it allowed events to occupy windows. Some windows overlapped, some did not. Some possible sightings became less compatible. Others remained viable. You can picture colored bands along a timeline, soft edges rather than hard points. The visual itself seems calmer, less insistent. It acknowledges the truth that old mornings rarely survive in exact minutes. The refined timeline suggested one important caution. If the depot sighting was accurate, then the post office sighting likely referred to someone else or to a different moment than originally believed. If the post office sighting was accurate, the depot sighting became harder but not impossible. The pale car could fit with either, both, or neither. This is not the kind of statement that satisfies a hungry mind, but it satisfies a careful one. It tells you the file is refusing to overbuild. From there, investigators considered whether two unrelated observations had been fused into one narrative over time. This often happens. A town hears of a missing person, then remembers a car, a coat, a figure, a call, and slowly the details drift toward one another. The story becomes smoother than the events. The Vertin case may have been shaped by such smoothing. The cold case panel recommended separating each observation completely before recombining any theory. It was slow work, but necessary. Separation meant each witness statement received its own page, stripped of later assumptions. What did this person say? When? To whom? After what publicity? And with what certainty? The result was sobering. Some strong-sounding leads weakened. Some neglected early statements gained value, because they were made before newspaper coverage. The file became less familiar to those who thought they knew it. You can feel the case turning slightly under the light, revealing a different surface without becoming a different object. One early statement, previously overlooked, came from a school janitor who saw a light-colored car near the service lane behind the post office 2 days before the disappearance, not on the morning itself. This may have been unrelated, but it suggested the car detail had existed before the public appeal. Detectives checked whether the same vehicle could have returned. There was no proof. Still, the timing mattered. It prevented the pale car from being dismissed entirely as newspaper-born memory. That is how careful review works. It does not swing from belief to disbelief. It adjusts. The pale car was not solid. It was not nothing. It existed somewhere in the middle, supported by early fragments and weakened by inconsistency. You can hold it there, neither forcing nor dropping it. A light-colored car in damp morning air, a shape near a curb, a possible return, a common vehicle that may have mattered precisely because common things pass unnoticed. The service lane behind the post office had a gravel surface in those years. The janitor remembered because his shoes carried grit into the school hallway afterward, and he had to sweep it before classes began. That sensory detail gave his statement a small ring of lived reality, though it did not prove the car's relevance. You can hear the broom across tile, the dry scratch of grit, the smell of floor wax in the school corridor. Memory attaches itself to chores as often as to drama. Detectives checked whether tire impressions had ever been recorded from the lane. They had not. No one knew to preserve them, if they existed. Rain, traffic, and time would have erased them quickly. The file simply notes that no tire evidence was available. Another small loss, ordinary and complete. You do not need to dwell on it sharply. It is enough to notice how many possible answers require someone, at the right moment, to know the future importance of something ordinary. No one knows that in time. That is the mercy and difficulty of the past. The janitor swept the grit. The clerk opened the window. The driver delivered parcels. The neighbor looked through branches. Each person lived the morning forward, while detectives later tried to read it backward. The Vertin case could never escape that mismatch. Life moves forward carelessly because it must. Investigation moves backward carefully because it has no other choice. Backward movement is slow. You can feel it in the record requests that took months. A letter sent to a county office. A reply saying the ledger had been moved. Another request to the archive. A note that staff would search when time allowed. Finally, a photocopy, faint and crooked, arriving in an envelope with a crease down the middle. Modern readers may forget how much waiting lived inside paperwork. The Vertin detectives could not click their way through the past. They had to write to it. Writing to the past is a phrase that suits the file. Every archive request is a letter to a room where something may still exist. Every interview with an elderly witness is a letter to a morning stored imperfectly in a mind. Every lab submission is a letter to matter itself, asking whether it has kept a trace. The Vertin case received many replies. Most said no. Some said maybe. A few said, here is a little more. None said enough. And still, the little mores mattered. The alley, the wider photograph, the corrected weather, the narrowed shop time, the weakened depot confidence, the possible early car, the family habit of initials. Each addition changed the file's texture. You can run your hand across that texture now, not literally, but in attention. It is uneven, like old cloth mended in several places. The mends do not make it new, they keep it from tearing further. The case's endurance also depended on people resisting the urge to discard what embarrassed earlier work. Some early assumptions were wrong. Some notes were incomplete. Some leads were overemphasized. Later investigators could have hidden that behind polished summaries. But the fuller file preserves the mistakes. That honesty is valuable. It lets the case teach. It lets future detectives see how uncertainty evolves. It lets the people in the file remain human, including the investigators themselves. No investigation is conducted by perfect minds. It is conducted by tired, sincere people under pressure, using tools of their era, within systems that may or may not support them well. The Vertin case shows this plainly. The early team missed some documentation. They also preserved crucial photographs, interviewed widely, and kept the case from disappearing. Later teams corrected some errors, introduced others, and kept returning. The file is not a monument to failure. It is a record of imperfect care lasting longer than most things do. You can let that be the tone as we continue. Imperfect care. It is a humane phrase. It holds effort and limitation together. The family's care was imperfect because memory and grief are imperfect. The witness's care was imperfect because seeing is imperfect. The detective's care was imperfect because work is imperfect. But care was present. In the Vertin case, care may be the most consistent fact after the disappearance itself. A document near the back of the box lists remaining unknowns in a clean table. It is tempting to read such a table quickly, but you slow down. Identity of initials, origin and relevance of telephone call, accuracy of depot sighting, identity and relevance of pale vehicle, status of key case, final confirmed movement after last ordinary contact, potential undiscovered records in external archives. Each line is a doorway, and none is fully open. The table is not a conclusion. It is a map of where listening continues. Beside each unknown, the detective added, next possible action, not solution. Action. That difference matters. For the initials, continue directory alerts. For the phone call, no action unless new records surface. For the depot, preserve witness uncertainty. For the vehicle, maintain comparison notes. For the key case, review photographs if new imaging becomes available. For final movement, reassess timeline when new data enters. The file stays oriented toward work, not wishful ending. The note about new imaging is interesting. Technology may one day clarify the blurred hallway object, or enhance shadows in a way current tools cannot, or it may not. The detective does not promise. He simply leaves the possibility marked. You can feel the humility again. Future methods are imagined as tools, not miracles. The Vertin case has already survived many waves of promised breakthroughs. It has learned to accept help without surrendering judgment. That judgment will matter if new information ever arrives. A name from the initials would have to be tested. A clearer photograph would have to be contextualized. A biological result would have to be connected to a relevant item. A confession, if one appeared, would need corroboration. The file cannot accept a gift without examining it. That is not distrust for its own sake. It is respect for truth, and for all the people who could be harmed by an easy mistake. The Vertin case, by remaining unresolved, reminds us that not every old mystery is waiting for one heroic insight. Some are waiting for a record that may never surface, a witness who may never speak, or a material trace too compromised to read. Some may never be answered because the answer depended on a moment no one preserved. This is a sad thought, but it can be held gently. It does not erase the value of the work done. It only tells us the world is not always retrievable. Retrieval is what archives attempt, and what memory attempts, and what detective work attempts. Each retrieves differently. Archives retrieve documents. Memory retrieves meaning. Detective work tries to retrieve enough of both to support an answer. The Vertin case sits where all three are incomplete. The documents are partial. The meanings are personal and shifting. The answer remains beyond reach. Yet the attempt itself has form, and we can follow that form like a path through a dim but orderly room. You might notice the room around you becoming quieter as the pages thin. Not ending, not yet, just quieter. The file has fewer new leads here, and more care instructions. More preservation, more measured recommendations. This is the late life of many cold cases. They become less active in the daily sense, but not dead. They wait for change, a database expansion, a family discovery, a lab advance, a conscience, a clerk digitizing the right page in the right distant archive. The distant archive is a recurring hope in the Vertin case. Because transportation routes mattered, records could exist outside the town's own holdings. A bus company ledger in a university collection, a railway employee diary, a hotel register miscatalogued under a business name, a police blotter in a neighboring jurisdiction. Detectives listed such possibilities, knowing most would never pay off, but listing them kept the search from shrinking too tightly around the familiar box. One request went to a railway museum that held employee newsletters. The newsletters did not mention the case, but they did confirm staffing at the depot during the relevant week. This allowed investigators to identify a substitute clerk not named in the original file. He had died decades earlier, but his personnel record placed him on duty. No statement from him exists. Was he overlooked? Was he asked informally? Did he see nothing? The file cannot answer. It simply adds his name to the world that morning. Adding a name can feel like progress and loss together. Progress, because the map is fuller. Loss, because the person who might have clarified something is gone. The Vertin case accumulates such late names. People discovered after their memories are no longer reachable. Records found after their authors are dead. Photographs clarified after the landscape has changed. The file becomes more complete exactly when the living past becomes less available. This is why early documentation matters so much, and why later detectives sometimes sound almost tender toward the first notes that do exist. A scribbled sentence from the first week may be more valuable than a polished memory 40 years later. The Vertin case preserves enough early material to keep working, but not enough to settle. That middle state is perhaps the hardest. There is too much to forget and too little to finish. So the file continues, neither empty nor whole. You continue with it now, turning to the railway staffing note. The substitute clerk lived in a boarding house near the tracks. Detectives checked whether his landlady had given any statement. She had not, at least not in the surviving file. Her name appears in a city directory, then disappears after a move. Later researchers found an obituary, then distant relatives, but no papers. Another faint possibility, another person who may have known nothing, or may have seen something too ordinary to remember until it was too late. The boarding house itself was demolished in the 1970s. A photograph in the Historical Society shows a narrow building with a deep porch and lace curtains in the windows. You can look at it softly. The porch boards look uneven. A bicycle leans near the steps. A sign advertises rooms by the week. It is not evidence in any strong sense. It is context, and context has its own quiet value. It gives the substitute clerk a place to have returned after work. Place after place enters the Vertin case this way. Some are central, some peripheral. All remind you that the case unfolded in a real town made of surfaces, distances, doors, windows, schedules, and weather. A mystery is often described as if it floats in thought, but it happens on floors that creak and streets that puddle. Detectives know this. That is why they keep walking routes, measuring sightlines, checking maps, and asking about the smell of rain or the position of a lamp. The Historical Society became an informal partner in later years. Volunteers helped locate photographs, directories, and event calendars. One volunteer found a church bulletin listing a meeting that explained why several potential witnesses were away from Hawthorne Street on the relevant evening. This did not solve the case, but it corrected assumptions about who might have seen the house. You can feel the town's archival memory working quietly, not as spectacle, but as service. Old paper, once saved for history, becomes part of care. Church bulletins, school programs, shop advertisements, club rosters, weather reports, property maps. These are not glamorous sources, but they are the fabric of patient investigation. The Vertin case had to be understood through fabric, not spotlight. Every thread had to be checked for color, strength, and relation to the others. Some threads broke, some were decorative, a few held parts of the pattern together. The whole cloth never became visible, but the investigators learned more about its weave. One bulletin also clarified that the cousin's planned visit would have coincided with a community supper, which may explain references to extra cooking in one family letter. For a moment, this ordinary planning makes the household feel close. Food to prepare, chairs to arrange, weather to consider. A repair near the back steps before guests arrived. None of it points directly to an answer, but it points to expectation. The future was being prepared for. The Vertin case interrupted a life that was still making room for later. That is one reason unresolved cases remain so affecting without any need for harsh detail. They are full of unfinished ordinary futures. A visit that did not happen as planned. A letter that became keepsake instead of correspondence. A drawer remembered for years. A street that changed while the question stayed. The detective's work is to honor the unfinished without inventing an ending. You can feel the delicacy of that task in every careful page. The file also contains practical frustration. Requests denied because records were purged. Leads delayed because staff were reassigned. A lab backlog stretching months. A witness unavailable because of illness. These are not dramatic obstacles. They are institutional weather. Every investigation moves through them. The Vertin case moved through decades of them, and each delay may have mattered in ways no one can measure. Yet complaining at the past does not help. Reading it clearly does. Clear reading shows that the case was not neglected in a simple way. It was revisited, reworked, preserved, and taught from. It also shows gaps that may never close. Both can be true. A case can be cared for and still unsolved. Detectives can do serious work and still fail to crack it. The Vertin case asks us to hold that complexity with patience, because simple judgments would be easier but less accurate. Accuracy is a form of peace in this room. Not happy peace exactly, but steadiness. When each fact has its right size, the mind no longer needs to keep inflating and deflating it. The phone call is remembered, but untraced. The initials are unexplained, but not proven sinister. The pale car is possible, but inconsistent. The depot sighting is early, but uncertain. The key case is unresolved. The family letters show ordinary expectation. The later searches show no confirmed trace. This is the table as it stands, and we keep sitting at that table, because the request was never to force an ending. It was to understand why detectives could never crack the Vertin case. The answer, if we say it softly, is that every promising path remained partly unsupported, and every hard fact stopped short of the next hard fact needed. The case was not silent, it spoke in fragments. But fragments, however many, do not always become a sentence strong enough to carry the truth into daylight. Still, fragments can be cared for. The green book can be sleeved, the letter can be returned to the cousin, the witness's uncertainty can be honored, the map can be corrected, the rumor can be tested and set aside, the family can be updated without spectacle, the file can be digitized without discarding the original. You can feel the consolation in those small acts. They do not answer the central question, but they keep the question from being mistreated. As the archive grows still around the imagined desk, you may hear the softer sounds, a chair settling, paper shifting, rain ticking against high glass, the faint hum of a machine keeping the air dry. The Vertin case remains open before you, but not demanding. It has waited through more nights than this. It can wait through one more. We turn another page, and the next page is not a revelation. It is a list of archive contacts, written in careful print, each name a possible doorway into some distant shelf where a small forgotten record may still be resting. The Vertin case rests there now, not because every question has been answered, but because the honest work has reached the edge of what the record can safely hold. No one was ever charged in the Vertin case, and the file remains unresolved, still open in that quiet official way, preserved for any future detail that might one day arrive without being forced. The answer never settled into the hands of the detectives, not in the old interviews, not in the photographs, not in the address book, and not in the later searches that carried the same hope forward with softer tools. You can let that be plain tonight. Some cases do not end with a name written firmly beneath the final line. Some remain as careful spaces in a cabinet, tended by people who understand that not knowing is not the same as not caring. The Vertin file was held that way, through paper and ink, through archive air and lamplight, through patient reviews that corrected what they could and left untouched what they could not honestly change. There is a kind of mercy in that restraint. And now the room can grow quieter around it. The green address book lies closed beneath its sleeve. The photographs no longer need to be lifted. The map of Hawthorne Street can soften back into folded paper, with its little marks and careful routes resting where they are. You have sat with the questions long enough for one night, and they ask nothing sharper from you now. Outside the imagined windows, the town is still only a town, with damp pavement, darkened porches, and the faint memory of a train somewhere beyond the last houses. The unanswered things remain unanswered, but they do not have to be carried all at once. The file can keep its silence in the cool archive, and for tonight, you can leave the lamp low, let the paper settle, and let the name Vertin fade gently into the quiet.